The moon would bless her tonight or curse her. The thought whispered through Sarah Mitchell's mind as she woke to pale dawn light filtering through her cabin's thin curtains. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a rhythm that seemed to echo the ancient drums that would sound tonight during the moon ceremony, the sacred ritual where destined mates were revealed under the blessing of the moon goddess. Sarah pressed her palm against her chest, feeling the wild flutter of her pulse. For weeks she had felt it, that inexplicable pull toward Alpha Jason Carter, the way her wolf stirred restlessly whenever he was near, the electricity that sparked between them during fleeting glances across the pack grounds, the dreams that left her breathless and aching, filled with silver light and the scent of pine. Could it be? The thought both thrilled and terrified her. Elder Marcus had warned that the moon goddess did not appreciate having her gifts spurned. Those who rejected true mates faced her wrath, and that of the ancient spirits who guarded the sacred bonds. She rose from bed and moved to the small mirror above her dresser. The reflection showed a young woman with gentle brown eyes and auburn hair that caught the morning light like burnished copper. Sarah had always been different from the other wolves in the Bloodfang Pack, quieter, more thoughtful, blessed with healing hands rather than warriors' claws. Her fingers traced the silver pendant at her throat, her mother's pack marker. Elena Mitchell had been a true warrior, Sarah thought, remembering the stories of her parents' legendary battles. They had died defending the pack's borders when Sarah was 12, their sacrifice still spoken of with reverence. How different she was from them. Where they had possessed razor-sharp instincts and fierce battle prowess, she had inherited only their gentle hearts and stubborn loyalty. The Bloodfang Pack prided itself on strength and dominance. They were warriors, protectors, wolves who commanded respect through power. Sarah had always felt like a songbird among eagles, too soft for their harsh world. But today might change everything. As twilight painted the sky in shades of violet and gold, the pack gathered in the sacred clearing deep within their territory. Ancient stones formed a perfect circle around the open space, their surfaces carved with symbols that predated human memory. The full moon hung heavy and silver overhead, its light seeming to pulse with otherworldly energy. Sarah found her place among the other unmated wolves, her stomach churning with nervous anticipation. She could feel Jason's presence like a physical force. He stood near the center of the circle with the elders, his broad shoulders rigid beneath his ceremonial black shirt. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in his jaw, the way his dark eyes scanned the crowd without settling on anyone. Jason Carter was everything an alpha should be: powerful, respected, commanding. At 26, he was the youngest alpha the pack had seen in decades. His leadership had brought prosperity and security to the Bloodfang territory, his strategic mind and fierce protectiveness earning him loyalty from every pack member. But with that power came crushing expectations. The Pack Council whispered constantly about his need for a strong Luna, someone who could stand beside him as an equal in battle and strategy. Someone who could bear strong pups and lead the Pack's warriors. Someone like Eleanor Cross, Sarah thought, glancing at the beautiful blonde warrior who stood with confident grace among the elite females. Eleanor was everything Sarah wasn't. Fierce, commanding, born to lead with fang and claw. The ceremony began with the elders' ancient chants, their voices weaving together in harmony that seemed to make the very air vibrate. Sarah's wolf stirred restlessly beneath her skin, responding to the sacred words and the moon's pull. The scent of burning sage and sacred herbs filled the clearing, carrying prayers to the moon goddess herself. Moon goddess, Elder Marcus intoned, his weathered hands raised toward the silver orb above. Reveal the bonds you have woven in starlight and shadow. Show us the hearts that beat as one, the souls you have chosen to walk together through all the phases of their lives. The energy in the clearing shifted, becoming thick and electric. Sarah felt her breath catch as a warm golden sensation spread through her chest like liquid sunlight. Her gaze found Jason's across the circle, and she saw his eyes widen in recognition. And something that looked like panic. The bond. It pulsed between them like a living thing, visible to their wolves if not their eyes. A thread of pure light that connected their souls, ancient and unbreakable. Sarah felt tears of joy prick her eyes as Jason began walking toward her, his expression unreadable but his steps sure. The crowd fell silent. Every pack member held their breath as their alpha approached the quiet Omega who had somehow captured the moon goddess's attention. Sarah heard whispers ripple through the gathering, surprise, confusion, anticipation. Jason stopped 3 feet away from Sarah, close enough that she could smell his scent, pine and earth and something uniquely him that made her wolf whimper with longing. The mate bond thrummed between them, stronger now, demanding acknowledgement. Sarah Mitchell, Jason's voice carried across the silent clearing, but Sarah caught the slight tremor in it, the way his hands clenched at his sides. She looked up at him, hope and love shining in her eyes. Jason, I can feel it. The bond, it's... I reject you. The words hit her like a physical blow. Sarah actually stumbled backward, one hand flying to her chest as pain exploded through her ribcage. But it was Jason's face that truly broke her heart. The way his jaw clenched, how his eyes squeezed shut for just a moment as if the words caused him physical pain. You are too weak to stand beside me, he continued, his voice growing stronger but his knuckles white with tension. I cannot accept you as my mate. I reject the bond the moon goddess has offered. But even as he spoke the ritual words, Sarah saw the truth in his eyes. The regret, the self-hatred, the way he seemed to be fighting his own wolf. She could hear it in the slight crack in his voice, see it in the rigid set of his shoulders. He doesn't want to do this, she realized with stunning clarity. But he's going to anyway. The clearing erupted in gasps and murmurs. Sarah heard them as if from underwater, surprise, cruel laughter, whispered excitement at the drama unfolding. But all she could focus on was the searing pain in her chest as the mate bond began to fray and tear, and the look of anguish that flashed across Jason's face before he shuttered his expression. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The world tilted sideways as something sacred and beautiful was ripped from her soul. Jason's rejection echoed in her mind, each word a dagger twisting deeper. Too weak, too weak. Too weak. In the distance, she heard Elder Marcus's sharp intake of breath. Alpha, the old man whispered, his voice carrying an edge of warning. The moon goddess does not forget such slights. To reject a true mate is to invite her wrath upon the pack. But Jason had already turned away, walking back to his place among the elders as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just destroyed her and possibly doomed them all. Meanwhile, in Jason's mind, his wolf was in complete chaos. Mate! It howled, clawing at his consciousness. She is ours! Why do you reject what is ours? Jason gritted his teeth, forcing his wolf down even as every instinct screamed at him to return to Sarah, to take back the words, to claim what the moon goddess had given him. But Councilman Burke's words echoed in his mind. The pack needs strength, not sentiment. That Omega will be our downfall. His wolf snarled and paced, showing him images of Sarah's gentle hands healing wounded pups, her quiet strength, her unwavering loyalty. She is perfect for us, it insisted. She is our heart. No, Jason told himself firmly, even as his hands shook. The pack comes first. It has to. But the hollow ache in his chest suggested otherwise. Later that night, Sarah sat on her cabin's small porch, staring at nothing. The celebration continued in the distance, laughter and music carrying on the wind like salt in a wound. She should go inside, should hide from the world, but she couldn't seem to move. Did you see her face? The voice drifted from the path near her cabin. Sarah recognized it as Melissa, one of the pack's gossips. "I've never seen someone look so pathetic." "I can't believe she actually thought she had a chance," came another voice. Derek, a mid-ranked warrior. "Jason needs a Luna who can fight beside him, not some fragile flower who faints at the sight of blood." "She's not even a real wolf," Melissa continued with cruel satisfaction. "More like a house pet, a Luna made of feathers, not fangs. Her parents must be rolling in their graves." Sarah's hands clenched into fists. Her parents, true warriors who had died protecting these ungrateful wolves, the same wolves who now mocked their daughter for lacking their killer instincts. Their laughter felt like claws raking down Sarah's back. She pressed her hands to her ears, but their words had already burrowed deep. Not a real wolf. Too weak. Pathetic. Sarah packed her belongings in the dark hour before dawn. There wasn't much. A few changes of clothes, some books, a wooden box containing her parents' military medals. She paused at the photograph on her nightstand. Her parents in their ceremonial uniforms, proud and strong. Eleanor Mitchell had been known for her strategic brilliance, David for his unwavering loyalty. Together they had been legends. What would they think of their daughter now? Would they be ashamed of the weak Omega who couldn't even keep her mate? No, she told herself firmly, clutching the photograph. They would be proud that I'm leaving with my dignity intact. They would want me to forge my own path. Sarah folded the photograph carefully and placed it in her bag. She had no idea where she would go, but she couldn't stay here. Not after last night. Not with the way the pack looked at her now. She slipped out of her cabin as the first pale light of dawn touched the horizon. The pack territory stretched before her, wild and beautiful and no longer home. At the border, she paused. The moment she stepped beyond the marked trees, she would be packless. Rogue, the mate bond, already damaged, would sever completely. But she would also be free. Sarah took a deep breath and stepped forward. The pain hit her like lightning, sharp, bright, cleansing. She gasped and fell to her knees as the last threads of the mate bond snapped. But underneath the agony, she felt something else. Liberation. "I don't need you, Jason Carter," she whispered to the morning wind. "Not anymore." She pulled off the silver pendant that marked her as a member of the Bloodfang Pack, her mother's pendant, the one thing that had connected her to her warrior heritage. For a moment she held it in her palm, feeling its weight and the memories it carried. Then she walked to the ancient oak tree where she'd played as a pup, where her parents had pushed her on a rope swing during the few precious years they'd had together. She dug a small hole at its base and buried the pendant, along with the last of her connection to this place. "I will be stronger," she vowed. "I will become the wolf I was meant to be, not the wolf they wanted me to be." As she shouldered her bag and turned toward the forest, Sarah felt a shift in the air. The morning mist seemed to shimmer, and for a moment she could have sworn she saw a figure watching her from the shadows. Tall, ethereal, with eyes that gleamed like starlight. The moon goddess. A whisper seemed to follow her as she walked into the wilderness. "Those who reject my gifts will learn the price of their pride." Sarah smiled grimly and answered the unspoken promise. In the distance, a wolf howled. Not in sorrow, but in something ancient and wild and free. Sarah lifted her chin and let her own voice rise strong and clear into the morning air. The rejected Omega was no more. In her place walked something new, something that would not be broken by cruel words or shattered bonds, something that would rise. Chapter 2. A Life in Isolation. The forest welcomed her like a long-lost friend. Sarah had been walking for 3 days when she found it, a hidden clearing deep within the ancient woods, far beyond the Bloodfang Pack's patrol routes. Towering pines stood sentinel around the sacred space, their branches creating a cathedral of green that filtered the sunlight into dancing patterns of gold and shadow. A crystal-clear stream wound through the heart of the clearing, its gentle babble the only sound besides the whisper of wind through moss-covered rocks. It felt like stepping into a dream. She knelt beside the stream, cupping the cold water in her hands to drink. As the liquid touched her lips, she felt something shift inside her, a loosening of the tight band of pain that had wrapped around her chest since the rejection. Here, in this untouched sanctuary, she could finally breathe. This is home now, she thought, settling her pack against the base of an enormous oak tree. This is where I begin again. The abandoned hunter's cabin stood like a forgotten memory at the edge of the clearing. Its walls were weathered grey, the roof partially collapsed, but the structure was sound enough to offer shelter. Sarah spent her first week reinforcing the cabin with fallen branches and moss, creating a modest but secure haven. She learned to live off the land with an ease that surprised her. Her healing knowledge extended to identifying edible plants and medicinal herbs. She crafted simple traps for small game, following lessons her father had taught her during childhood camping trips. Each success felt like a small victory against the voice in her head that whispered too weak. The soundscape of solitude became her constant companion. Birdsong at dawn, the rustle of leaves in the afternoon breeze, the distant howl of wild wolves at night, nature's symphony replaced the cruel laughter and whispered gossip of the pack. Sometimes the silence felt comforting, a balm to her wounded soul. Other times it pressed against her like a physical weight, making her ache for the simple sound of another voice. But it was in the quiet moments that the memories crept in. Sarah laughed as Jason tried to demonstrate a complex fighting technique, his usually perfect form awkward as he showed her the gentler defensive moves suitable for an omega. "You're thinking too hard," she teased, stepping closer to adjust his stance. Their eyes met, and for a moment the world narrowed to just the two of them. His hand found hers, fingers intertwining naturally. "Maybe I just like having you close," he murmured, his voice soft and warm. She felt the mate bond hum between them, not yet acknowledged but real as breathing. In that moment she believed in forever. Sarah jolted back to the present, her heart hammering as the phantom warmth of Jason's touch faded. These flashbacks came without warning, fragments of what had been or what she'd thought had been. They left her questioning everything. Had those moments been real, or merely the mate bond's illusion? Had Jason ever truly cared for her, or had duty always been stronger than whatever they'd shared? The broken mate bond still haunted her. She'd wake from dreams filled with the scent of pine and earth, her body aching for a touch that would never come again. Sometimes she caught herself reaching for him across the empty cabin, expecting to find his solid warmth beside her. The phantom sensations blurred the line between love and trauma, making it impossible to separate genuine emotion from the mystical connection that had bound them. Was any of it real? She wondered during the long, lonely nights. Or was I just a fool chasing shadows? Despite the heartbreak, Sarah survived. More than survived. She thrived in ways that would have surprised anyone from the pack. She learned to read the forest's moods, to predict weather changes by the way the leaves turned their faces to the sky. She tended to injured animals with gentle hands, earning their trust and gratitude. A family of foxes made their den near her cabin, their kit playing fearlessly around her feet. There was quiet resilience in her every action, unrecognized by those who had dismissed her, but powerful nonetheless. She was not the weak Omega they believed her to be. She was something else entirely. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, Sarah found herself thinking of her parents. She sat by the stream, watching the water flow over smooth stones, and let the memories wash over her. "Eleanor," her father had said one night as he tucked young Sarah into bed, "your mother wasn't the fiercest warrior because she was the strongest. She was the fiercest because she fought with her heart, not just her claws." "Tell me about the compassionate leaders, Papa," Sarah had whispered, snuggling deeper into her blankets. "There was a she-wolf named Astrid," he'd continued, his voice taking on the cadence of ancient stories. "She led not through fear or dominance, but through understanding. Her pack was the strongest because they fought for love, not conquest. The moon goddess blessed her with gifts that went beyond physical strength, the ability to heal, to see into hearts, to bring peace where there was only war. "Do you think I could be like her someday?" Sarah had asked. "My little moon child," he'd said, kissing her forehead. "I think you already are." Sarah wiped away tears she hadn't realized were falling. "Would you be proud of me now, Papa?" she wondered. "Would you understand why I had to leave?" It was during her second week in the forest that Sarah discovered the healing grove. Hidden within a cluster of ancient birch trees, the space felt charged with otherworldly energy. The air itself seemed to shimmer with an almost visible light, and when she rested there, her emotions settled into something approaching peace. She didn't understand what made the grove special, but she found herself drawn there whenever the phantom pain of the broken mate bond became too much to bear. Something ancient stirred in her veins when she sat among the silver-barked trees. An unexplained calm, visions of light dancing behind her closed eyelids, dreams of wolves with eyes like starlight. What is this place, she wondered, but the forest kept its secrets. The warning came on a night when the moon was dark and the stars seemed distant. Sarah woke to an unnatural silence. No cricket songs, no owl calls, no rustle of small creatures moving through the underbrush. Even the wind had stilled. She crept to her cabin's window and peered out into the darkness. The forest felt wrong, charged with a tension that made her wolf pace restlessly beneath her skin. Animals fled past her clearing, rabbits, foxes, even a young deer, all running from something unseen. The moon, when it finally broke through the clouds, felt cold and distant. Sarah shivered despite the warm night air, sensing an unnatural presence lurking at the edges of her sanctuary. Something was coming. Something that didn't belong. The storm hit 3 days later with a fury that seemed to echo the tempest in Sarah's soul. Thunder crashed overhead as rain lashed against the cabin's windows. Lightning illuminated the clearing in stark silver flashes that made the shadows dance like living things. Sarah stood in the doorway, watching the wild display of nature's power. The storm called to something deep within her, something that had been building since the rejection, since the exile, since the moment she'd walked away from everything she'd ever known. "Let it out," a voice whispered in her mind. "Let it all out." She stepped into the rain. The cold droplets hit her skin like tiny hammers, but she didn't care. She tilted her face to the sky and let the storm wash over her. All the pain, all the rage, all the grief she'd been holding back rose to the surface like floodwater breaking through a dam. She screamed. The sound tore from her throat raw and primal, carrying all her heartbreak into the howling wind. She cried for the love she'd lost, for the future that had been ripped away, for the pack that had cast her out like she was nothing. She howled her rage at the moon goddess who had blessed her with a mate, only to watch him throw her away. The rain became her baptism, washing away the last vestiges of the weak omega she'd been. In the storm's embrace, she found something that had been buried beneath years of doubt and self-recrimination. Strength. When the storm finally passed, Sarah stood dripping in the clearing, her hair plastered to her head and her clothes soaked through. But she felt different, cleaner, as if the rain had washed away more than just dirt and tears. She closed her eyes and let the change come. The shift was unlike any she'd experienced before. Usually her transformations were awkward, uncertain things that left her feeling exposed and vulnerable. But this time, her wolf rose with fluid grace, power flowing through her like liquid moonlight. She opened her eyes and saw her reflection in the still water of the stream. Her wolf was nothing like the other females in the pack. No golden coat or brown eyes. Her fur was midnight black, shot through with silver, and her eyes glowed with an inner light that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages. Beautiful, she thought, and for the first time in her life, she believed it. This was not the wolf of a weak omega. This was something else entirely, something that had been hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Who am I? She wondered, but the question felt less like confusion and more like the beginning of discovery. While exploring the deeper reaches of the forest, Sarah came across a standing stone half hidden by ivy and moss. The monolith was ancient, older than the pack territories, older perhaps than the packs themselves. Runes covered its surface, symbols that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. She approached cautiously, her wolf senses alert for any sign of danger, but the stone felt welcoming, as if it had been waiting for her. When she reached out to touch the carved symbols, her hand began to glow with a soft silver light. The runes responded, flaring brighter for a moment before settling back into their dormant state. Sarah jerked her hand back, heart pounding. What was that? She thought, staring at her palm as if it belonged to someone else. What's happening to me? But even as fear flickered through her, she felt something else. Recognition. As if some part of her had always known this moment would come. A week later, the familiar scent of a Bloodfang patrol reached her clearing. Sarah's heart raced as she caught the mingled scents of pack wolves, and underneath it all, the distinct pine and earth smell that was uniquely Jason's. She crept to the edge of the clearing, hidden behind a cluster of ferns, and watched as 3 wolves padded through the distant trees. Jason's black wolf led them, his massive form moving with predatory grace. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his head swiveled as if searching for something. Searching for me? She wondered, and hated herself for the flutter of hope in her chest. She almost called out, almost stepped from her hiding place and revealed herself. The broken mate bond tugged at her, whispering that she belonged at his side, that this exile was just a nightmare she could wake from. But then she remembered the coldness in his voice during the rejection, the way he'd turned away from her as if she meant nothing. The cruel laughter of the pack as she stood broken in the center of the sacred circle. Not yet, she whispered to herself, pressing deeper into the shadows. I'm not ready. Will I ever be ready, she wondered, but let the question go unanswered. The patrol passed without incident, leaving only the lingering scent of home and heartbreak in their wake. That night, as Sarah sat by her small fire working on a new herb poultice, she heard it, a howl that made her blood run cold. It was unlike any sound she'd ever heard before, broken and wild and filled with a hunger that spoke of madness. Rogue. The howl came from the direction of the old standing stone, too close to her sanctuary for comfort. Sarah's wolf rose to alertness, every instinct screaming danger. She'd heard stories of rogue wolves, pack members who had been cast out or who had chosen to leave, only to lose themselves to the wildness. They were dangerous, unpredictable, driven by pain and isolation into something barely recognizable as wolf. Like me, she thought with a chill, then pushed the fear away. No, I'm not like them. I won't let the exile break me. But as the howl echoed through the night again, closer this time, Sarah realized that her quiet life in the forest was about to change. The sanctuary she'd built was no longer safe. She was no longer alone. And something told her that the rogue's presence was no coincidence. The forest was trying to tell her something, and she had a feeling she wouldn't like what she discovered. Sarah banked her fire and retreated to her cabin, but sleep eluded her. Outside, the night wind carried the scent of danger and the promise of challenges to come. Her exile was about to become something far more complicated than simple heartbreak. Chapter 3. Whisper of Rogues. The forest had been trying to warn her for days. Sarah noticed it first in the way the birds moved. Not their usual lazy circles through the canopy, but frantic, desperate flights that spoke of panic. Squirrels chattered anxiously from high branches, and the deer that normally grazed peacefully in her clearing had vanished entirely. Even the family of foxes that had made their den near her cabin seemed on edge, their usual playful antics replaced by nervous vigilance. She stood at the edge of her sanctuary, breathing deeply, and sorting through the complex tapestry of scents that the wind carried. Beneath the familiar smells of pine and earth, moss and stream water, something else lurked, something that made her wolf pace restlessly beneath her skin. Blood and rot, she realized with a chill. And something else. Something wild and desperate. The scent was faint but unmistakable, carried on the morning breeze from the direction of the old borders. Sarah's heart clenched with sudden fear, not for herself, but for the pack she'd left behind. Rogues. She was gathering herbs in the deeper woods when she first caught their scent properly, sharp, wild, untainted by pack bonds or civilization. The smell hit her like a physical blow, bringing back memories she'd tried to bury. 8 years old, hiding in the root cellar while her parents fought alongside the pack against a rogue incursion. The screams, the snarls, the scent of blood so thick it seemed to coat her tongue. When it was over, her friend Maya's father never came home. Sarah crouched behind a fallen log, her breath coming in shallow gasps as the foreign scents grew stronger. These weren't the usual lone wolves driven mad by isolation. There were too many of them, their scents blending together in a way that suggested organization, purpose. She waited, motionless, until the scents faded before creeping back toward her cabin. But the damage was done. The peace of her sanctuary had been shattered. That night, the howls began. They weren't the melodious songs of pack wolves or the lonely calls of the truly wild. These were aggressive, discordant sounds that spoke of rage and hunger and something darker. Sarah lay in her narrow bunk, listening to the cacophony echo through the forest, and felt ice form in her veins. They're organized, she realized with growing dread. Someone's leading them. The howls continued until dawn, a symphony of threat that left her exhausted and on edge. When she finally ventured outside, she found claw marks on the trees at the edge of her clearing, deep gouges that hadn't been there the day before. A message, a warning. They know I'm here. Sarah's memories dragged her back to the last rogue attack 5 years ago. She'd been 19, still clinging to the hope that she might find her place in the pack despite her gentle nature. The rogues had come in the dead of winter, desperate and starving, driven by a madness that made them more dangerous than any natural predator. "Stay in the safe house," Jason had commanded, his voice tight with authority and fear. He'd been 21 then, not yet alpha, but already showing the leadership that would earn him the position. "Don't come out until we give the all clear." But Sarah had been unable to simply wait. When the fighting grew close to the safe house, when she heard the screams of the injured, she'd crept out with her healing supplies. She'd found Maya bleeding in the snow, her leg nearly severed by rogue claws. "You saved her," Jason had said later, his voice soft with something that might have been admiration. "You could have stayed safe, but you chose to help." It had been one of the first times he'd truly seen her, not as the weak Omega everyone dismissed, but as someone with her own kind of courage. Now, hiding in the forest like a rogue herself, Sarah wondered if he remembered that night, if he remembered her at all. The pack's fear was palpable even from a distance. Sarah could smell it on the wind when patrols passed near her territory, the sharp scent of anxiety mixed with determination. She caught fragments of their conversations, whispered words that made her blood run cold. They're moving in groups now, coordinated attacks. Someone's leading them. Someone's smart. The border scouts found 3 more kills yesterday. They're not just hunting for food, they're sending a message. Sarah pressed herself deeper into the shadows, her heart hammering as she listened to wolves she'd once called family discuss the growing threat. Part of her wanted to step forward, to offer her help, to rejoin the pack that had raised her. But she remembered the cruel laughter on the night of her rejection, the way they'd dismissed her as weak and worthless. They made their choice, she reminded herself, and I made mine. But the knowledge that they were in danger still twisted in her chest like a physical wound. From her hiding place in the dense undergrowth, Sarah watched Jason address a patrol at the border. He stood tall and commanding, his presence filling the space around him with an authority that was both natural and hard-won. But she could see the strain in the set of his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched as he listened to the reports. "Double the patrols," he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "No one travels alone. If you see anything, you report it immediately." "Alpha," one of the warriors said hesitantly, "some of the council members are saying, they're saying the moon goddess might be angry with us, that rejecting your true mate might have weakened our protection." Sarah saw Jason's face go rigid, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. For a moment, she thought he might strike the warrior who had dared to voice what everyone was thinking. But then he seemed to gather himself, his expression smoothing into the mask of control he wore so well. "The moon goddess blessed us with strength and unity," he said, his voice deadly calm. "We don't need fairy tales to protect ourselves. We need discipline, strategy, and the will to fight." But Sarah caught the flicker of doubt in his eyes, the way his gaze drifted toward the deeper woods where she might be hiding. Even from a distance she could see the weight he carried, the burden of leadership in a time of crisis, the pressure of a pack that was beginning to question his judgment. Good, she thought with a fierce satisfaction that surprised her. Let him doubt, let him suffer like I suffered. But beneath the anger she felt something else, a treacherous flutter of concern for the man who had once been her everything. The emotions warred within her as she watched Jason rally his warriors. Fear for her former packmates, rage at being discarded, guilt for still caring about the man who had rejected her so cruelly. It was a toxic mixture that left her feeling nauseated and confused. He speaks of loyalty and sacrifice, she thought bitterly, as Jason's voice carried on the wind. But he threw away his own mate for political convenience. What kind of leader does that make him? Yet she couldn't deny the way the pack responded to him. The way even the most skeptical warriors straightened under his gaze, the way his presence seemed to inspire confidence even in the face of an unknown threat. "He's still the same man you fell in love with," a treacherous voice whispered in her mind. "The same man who used to look at you like you were his whole world. Before he decided his world was too small for you," she reminded herself harshly. Sarah's first direct encounter with the rogues came when she was least prepared for it. She'd been returning from the healing grove, her mind calm and focused after spending the morning in meditation, when she caught the scent of unfamiliar wolves approaching her territory. She dropped to the ground immediately, using every skill her father had taught her about moving unseen through the forest. The rogues passed within 20 feet of her hiding place. 2 males, their fur matted and wild, their eyes holding the dangerous glint of wolves who had lost their connection to civilization. "The Alpha thinks he's untouchable," one of them snarled, his voice rough with disuse. "But he's weak, rejected his own mate. The moon goddess won't protect him now." "Marcus says we hit the eastern border next," the other replied. "Take out their patrols one by one, show them what happens when they think they're better than us." Sarah's blood turned to ice. Marcus. She knew that name, Marcus Thornfield, a warrior who had been banished from the pack 3 years ago for killing a packmate in a dominance challenge. He'd been strong, cunning, and utterly ruthless. If he was leading the rogues. The 2 males moved on, their scents fading into the distance. Sarah remained hidden until she was certain they were gone, then crept back to her cabin on shaking legs. They know about the rejection, she realized with growing dread. They know Jason's vulnerable. The wounded scout stumbled into her clearing 2 days later, his left side torn open by claws and his breathing labored. Sarah's first instinct was to retreat, to let him pass without revealing herself. But when she saw the extent of his injuries, her healer's instincts overrode her caution. "Easy," she whispered, approaching him slowly with her hands raised. "I'm here to help." The scout, a young male named Derek whom she remembered from her pack days, looked at her with glazed eyes. "Sarah? Sarah Mitchell? But you're supposed to be dead?" Gone? I know. She helped him settle against a tree, her hands already moving to assess his wounds. What happened to you? Rogues, he gasped, his voice barely audible. They knew exactly where to find us, knew our patrol routes. It's like they have someone on the inside. Sarah's hands stilled on his wounds. What do you mean? They're not just random attacks. They're strategic, coordinated. Derek's eyes focused on her with effort. They're being led by someone who knows the pack, someone who wants to see us fall. Who? Sarah asked, though she already suspected the answer. Marcus Thornfield. He's back. And he's bringing hell with him. Sarah worked through the night to save Derek's life, using every healing skill she possessed. As dawn broke, she helped him to his feet, supporting his weight as he prepared to return to the pack. Tell them about the rogues, she said quietly. Tell them Marcus is planning something bigger than random attacks. Derek nodded, then paused. Sarah, why are you helping me? After what happened at the ceremony? Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Because some things are more important than personal pain. The pack is in danger. That matters more than my hurt feelings. The Alpha. He's not the same since you left. He's harder, more distant. Some say he regrets what he did. It doesn't matter now, Sarah said firmly, though her heart clenched at the words. Just get back to the pack. Warn them. Derek nodded and disappeared into the forest, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts and the growing certainty that her peaceful exile was about to come to an end. From her position on the high ridge that overlooked the Bloodfang territory, Sarah watched Jason address the pack in the main clearing. Even from this distance, she could see his commanding presence, the way he held himself with the confidence of a born leader. But she could also see the tension in his posture, the way his gaze kept drifting towards the forest where unknown dangers lurked. We face a threat unlike any we've encountered before. His voice carried on the wind. But we are Bloodfang. We are warriors. We will stand together, fight together, and protect what is ours. The pack responded with howls of support, their voices rising in a chorus of determination. Sarah felt her own wolf stir in response, the ancient call of pack loyalty pulling at her despite everything that had happened. We will not be driven from our territory by rogues and outcasts, Jason continued. We will not bow to those who have forgotten what it means to be part of something greater than themselves. Sarah's lip curled at the irony. Spoken like a true hypocrite, she thought bitterly. You discarded your own mate for the sake of appearances, and now you speak of loyalty and sacrifice. But even as anger flared in her chest, she couldn't deny the way his words stirred something in her. The pack was her family, had been her home for most of her life. Whatever Jason had done to her, she couldn't simply stand by and watch them fall to Marcus's revenge. Later that night, Sarah made her way to the neutral ground where she'd once helped an injured lone wolf, a female named River who owed her a debt. She found River's scent trail easily and followed it to a small cave hidden in the rocky outcropping. I need you to deliver a message, Sarah said without preamble when River appeared at the cave entrance. Sarah Mitchell, I heard you were dead. Not dead, just absent. Will you help me? River studied her for a long moment, then nodded. What's the message? Tell the Bloodfang Pack that the rogues are planning an attack on the eastern border. 3 days from now at dawn. They'll hit the patrol changeover when defenses are weakest. How do you know this? It doesn't matter, just tell them. River nodded again and disappeared into the night. Sarah could only hope that the warning would be enough, that the pack would listen to intelligence from an unknown source. The next morning, Sarah watched from the tree line as River approached the border guards. She saw the wolves' initial wariness give way to interest as River delivered the message. But then, one of the guards, a grizzled veteran named Connor, shook his head dismissively. Anonymous tips from rogues, his voice carried on the wind. Could be a trap, could be misinformation. Whoever she is, she's no longer one of us. Why should we trust her? Because she saved my life once, River replied firmly, and because she's never lied to me. Not our problem anymore, Connor said with finality. Tell your friend to keep her warnings to herself. We don't need help from traitors. Sarah felt her heart sink as River disappeared back into the forest, her mission unsuccessful. The pack's pride would be their downfall. They'd rather risk an attack than accept help from someone they considered an outsider. Fine, she thought grimly. Do it the hard way. But don't say I didn't try to warn you. From her vantage point on the highest ridge in the territory, Sarah saw them just as the sun began to set. Dozens of dark figures moving through the forest beyond the tree line, their movements coordinated and purposeful. They emerged from the shadows like ghosts, gathering in a formation that spoke of military precision. This wasn't the desperate, chaotic attack of starving rogues. This was strategy. This was war. At the center of the gathering, she could make out a larger figure. Marcus Thornfield, his scarred form unmistakable even at this distance. He stood like a general surveying his troops, his presence commanding even among the wild rogues who had flocked to his cause. How many? Sarah counted quickly, her heart sinking with each new figure she spotted. 50? 60? More arriving every minute. The Bloodfang Pack was strong, but they weren't prepared for an assault of this magnitude. Their patrols were designed to handle individual rogues or small groups, not an organized army. They're going to die, she realized with cold certainty. They're going to die because they were too proud to listen to a warning from their rejected Omega. Sarah crouched on the ridge, watching the enemy gather in the growing darkness. Tomorrow, when the attack came, she would have to make a choice. She could remain hidden, safe in her exile while her former pack fought for their lives. Or she could do what she'd always done, put others' needs before her own, even if they'd cast her aside. Even if it means facing him again, she thought, her heart clenching at the thought of seeing Jason in the midst of battle. Below her, the rogue army continued to grow, their howls rising into the night like a promise of bloodshed. War was coming to the Bloodfang territory, and Sarah Mitchell, the rejected Omega, who was supposed to be too weak to matter, might be the only one who could tip the balance. Tomorrow, she decided, her jaw setting with grim determination. Tomorrow I'll remind them all what they chose to throw away. Chapter 4. The Awakening. Sarah was gathering moonflower petals near the forest's edge when they found her. The first hint of danger came as a shift in the wind, a wild, unwashed scent that made her wolf recoil in instinctive alarm. She straightened slowly, her hand moving to the small knife at her belt, but it was already too late. 5 rogues emerged from the undergrowth like shadows given form, their eyes gleaming with predatory hunger. Their leader, a scarred male with patches of missing fur, grinned to reveal yellowed fangs. "Well, well," he rasped, his voice rough from disuse. "What do we have here? A little lost Omega all alone in the big bad woods." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as the rogues spread out, forming a circle around her. She recognized the tactic. They were herding her, cutting off escape routes with practiced efficiency. These weren't mindless beasts driven by starvation. They were hunters. "I don't want any trouble," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her throat. "I'm no threat to you." The leader laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, but you are, little Omega. You're exactly what we've been looking for." "What do you mean?" "Marcus has a special interest in strays from the Bloodfang Pack. Says they might be useful for his plans." His grin widened. "But first, we're going to have a little fun." The closest rogue lunged without warning, his claws extended and aimed for her throat. Sarah threw herself sideways, but she wasn't fast enough. Pain erupted across her shoulder as razor-sharp claws raked through flesh and fabric, sending her stumbling backward. Blood, her blood, splattered across the forest floor. And something inside her snapped. The world tilted sideways, colours bleeding into each other like watercolours in rain. Sarah's vision blurred, but not from weakness or pain. It was as if someone had suddenly turned up the volume on every sense she possessed. She could hear the rogues' heartbeats, rapid and excited. She could smell their individual scents, fear, bloodlust, the sour tang of madness. She could feel their emotions pressing against her like physical weights, hunger, rage, cruel anticipation. What's happening to me? Power surged through her veins like liquid fire, starting from her core and spreading outward until every nerve ending sang with electric energy. The wound on her shoulder stopped bleeding, the pain fading to a distant throb as her body began to heal itself. "What the hell?" one of the rogues started to say, but his words were cut off as the wind suddenly picked up, howling through the trees with supernatural fury. The ancient oaks around them began to tremble, their massive trunks creaking as if responding to some unheard command. The ground beneath Sarah's feet vibrated with a deep, thrumming energy that seemed to rise from the earth's core. And then she looked down at her arms. Symbols were appearing on her skin, not tattoos, but something deeper, as if they were being carved by light itself. Ancient runes spiraled along her forearms, pulsing with a soft silver glow that made the rogues step back in confusion and growing fear. "She's not normal," one of them whispered, his voice high with panic. "She's not normal." But Sarah was no longer listening to their words. Something was calling to her, something ancient and wild and magnificent. Her wolf rose to the surface, but it was different now, changed, enhanced, touched by power that had slumbered in her bloodline for generations. The shift came faster than it ever had before, smoother, as if her body had been waiting for this moment all her life. But when she opened her eyes and looked at her reflection in a nearby stream, she barely recognized herself. Her fur was midnight black, shot through with streaks of silver blue that seemed to move like liquid starlight. Her eyes blazed with white fire, and an ethereal aura surrounded her form, making her appear larger, more imposing than any wolf should be. "What am I?" she wondered, but the question felt distant, unimportant compared to the raw power coursing through her veins. The rogues were backing away now, their earlier confidence replaced by primal terror. They'd come hunting an omega, expecting easy prey. Instead, they'd found something that their deepest instincts told them to fear. Sarah, or the being she had become, opened her mouth and let out a sound that was part howl, part song, part battle cry. It resonated through the forest like a bell tolling, carrying notes of power that made the very air shimmer. The rogues didn't just hear it, they felt it in their bones, in their souls. It disoriented them, sending them stumbling backward as if the sound itself was a physical force pushing them away. "Run!" their leader screamed, his voice cracking with terror. "Run!" They scattered into the forest like leaves before a hurricane, leaving Sarah alone in the clearing with the echoes of her otherworldly howl still ringing in the air. The power left her all at once like a tide rushing back to sea. She collapsed to her hands and knees, her human form returning as consciousness wavered. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was the glowing symbols on her arms, fading to nothing more than faint, silver scars. In the space between waking and sleeping, Sarah found herself standing in a moonlit grove that was both familiar and utterly alien. Ancient trees towered around her, their trunks carved with the same runes that had appeared on her skin, and there in the center of the clearing stood a she-wolf unlike any she had ever seen. The wolf was massive, her coat shimmering with colors that had no names, silver and blue and starlight woven together in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Her eyes held the wisdom of ages, and when she spoke, her voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You have awakened, daughter of moonlight and shadow," the spirit wolf said, her words carrying the weight of prophecy. "The power that sleeps in your bloodline has finally stirred." "What power?" Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure if she spoke aloud or merely thought the words. "What am I?" You are more than blood and bone, child. You are born of spirit, touched by the moon goddess herself. Your line is ancient, older than the packs, older than the territories they fight over. You are what your people call spirit-touched, a bridge between the mortal world and the realm of the divine. The grove began to shimmer around the edges, reality bleeding back in. But the spirit wolf's final words followed Sarah into waking. The time of hiding is over. Your people need you, whether they know it or not. The choice is yours. Embrace what you are, or watch the world burn. Sarah woke in her cabin, gasping and disoriented. Pale morning light filtered through the windows, and her body ached as if she'd been hit by a truck. But when she looked at her shoulder, where the rogue's claws had torn through flesh and fabric, she found only smooth, unmarked skin. It wasn't a dream, she realized, sitting up slowly. It really happened. Her body felt different, stronger, more alive than it had ever been. Her senses remained heightened, allowing her to hear a mouse scurrying through the walls, to smell the various scents of the forest with crystal clarity. Energy hummed beneath her skin like a barely contained electrical current. She stumbled to her feet and made her way to the small mirror above her wash basin. The face that looked back at her was familiar but changed. Her eyes held flecks of silver that hadn't been there before, and when she pushed up her sleeves, she could see faint marks on her forearms, not the blazing runes from the night before, but subtle scars that looked like they'd been carved by moonlight. "What am I?" she whispered to her reflection, but the woman in the mirror had no answers. Panic began to build in her chest. Her entire identity had been built around being the weak Omega, the gentle healer who couldn't hurt a fly. Now she had power, real, tangible power that could send rogues fleeing in terror. The cognitive dissonance was almost unbearable. What if I lose control? She thought frantically. What if I become something monstrous? The very idea made her stomach turn. She'd spent her whole life being afraid of violence, of the casual cruelty that pack life sometimes demanded. Now she had the power to be truly dangerous, and the thought terrified her more than any rogue attack. She returned to the ancient grove later that day, drawn by an instinct she couldn't name. The standing stone was still there, covered in ivy and moss, but now she could feel the energy emanating from it, the same energy that had awakened in her during the attack. As she approached, the forest seemed to respond to her presence. Birds settled on nearby branches, watching her with what looked like expectation. Small animals emerged from their hiding places, showing no fear as they gathered around her feet. Even the trees seemed to lean in, as if listening to a conversation only they could hear. The forest knows, she realized with wonder. It recognizes what I've become. She placed her hand on the stone again, and this time the response was immediate. The runes blazed to life, not with the chaotic power of the night before, but with a steady, welcoming glow. Images flashed through her mind, glimpses of other wolves like her, spirit-touched guardians who had protected the balance between the mortal and divine realms. They were feared, she understood with sudden clarity. Not because they were evil, but because they were powerful. Because they represented something beyond the pack hierarchies and territorial disputes that defined most wolves' lives. That evening, Sarah sat by her fire reading through her mother's old journal, a leather-bound book she'd carried with her into exile, but had never been able to bring herself to open. Now, with her new understanding of her heritage, she found herself drawn to its pages. The old legends speak of wolves blessed by the moon goddess, her mother had written in her careful script. They called them spirit-touched, bridge-walkers, guardians of the ancient ways. Most dismissed them as fairy tales, but my grandmother swore they were real. She said they appeared in times of great need, when the balance between order and chaos threatened to break. Sarah's hands trembled as she read on. The gift skips generations, sometimes appearing in bloodlines that have forgotten their true heritage. It manifests in times of extreme stress or danger, awakening dormant abilities that most wolves can't even comprehend. They are not bound by pack laws or territorial limitations. They serve a higher purpose. The last known spirit touch died nearly a century ago, but Grandmother believed the bloodline continued, waiting for the right moment to emerge. She said they would be misunderstood, feared, possibly even hunted, but they would also be necessary. I pray my daughter never has to carry such a burden, but if she does, I hope she finds the strength to embrace her true nature. Sarah closed the journal with shaking hands. Her mother had known. Elena Mitchell had understood what her daughter might become, and she died before she could prepare her for it. But she left me this, Sarah realized, clutching the journal to her chest. She left me the knowledge I need to understand. As night fell, Sarah sat on the porch of her cabin staring up at the full moon. For the first time since the rejection, she felt complete. Not because the pain was gone, that still ached in her chest like a physical wound, but because she finally understood her place in the world. She wasn't a weak Omega who had been cast aside. She was something else entirely, something that had been sleeping in her bloodline for generations, waiting for the right moment to emerge. The rogue's attack wasn't random, she realized. It was a catalyst. The danger, the blood, the fear, it all combined to wake something that had been dormant since birth. She thought of the spirit wolf from her vision, of the ancient wisdom in those otherworldly eyes. Your people need you, whether they know it or not. The Bloodfang Pack was still in danger. Marcus and his rogue army were still gathering, still planning their assault, and Sarah was no longer the helpless exile she'd been when she first fled into the forest. But am I ready for this? She wondered. Am I ready to face them all again, to face him as something completely different from what they expect? The answer came not from her mind, but from her heart. She rose to her feet and walked to the edge of her clearing, tilting her face toward the moon. Then, for the first time since her transformation, she let out a howl. It wasn't the desperate cry of a lone wolf seeking her pack. It wasn't a call for help or a lament for what she'd lost. It was an announcement, a declaration of presence, of power, of a new player entering the game. Her voice rose clear and strong into the night air, carrying notes of authority and mystery that made the forest itself seem to listen. This was the howl of a spirit-touched wolf, a guardian awakening to her true purpose. And in the distance, carried on the wind from somewhere beyond the boundaries of the known world, another howl answered. It was ancient, otherworldly, filled with the same power that now flowed through her veins. Not Jason's voice, not any mortal wolf's call, but something older, something that recognized her for what she had become. Sarah smiled, her heart racing with anticipation and fear in equal measure. The time of hiding was over. The time of being dismissed as weak and worthless was finished. Tomorrow she would make a choice that would change everything. Tonight she would rest in the knowledge that she was no longer alone. The spirit touched had awakened, and the world would never be the same. Chapter 5. The Pack's Dilemma. The scent of blood and antiseptic filled Jason's nostrils as he walked through the makeshift infirmary. What had once been the Pack's community hall now resembled a battlefield hospital, cots lined up in neat rows to accommodate the growing number of wounded. Too many, he thought, his jaw clenching as he surveyed the casualties. Far too many. 3 patrols hadn't returned from their routes. The bodies they'd recovered bore evidence of coordinated attacks, precise strikes that spoke of military training, not the random violence of desperate rogues. These weren't mindless beasts driven by hunger. They were soldiers. Dr. Hayes, the Pack's physician, approached with dark circles under her eyes. She'd been working around the clock, her healing abilities pushed to their limits. "Alpha," she said quietly, her voice hoarse with exhaustion. "We've lost 2 more during the night. The injuries? They're too severe for conventional healing." Jason nodded grimly. "What about the others?" "Stable, but barely." If we don't find a way to end this soon. She trailed off, but they both knew what she meant. The pack was bleeding out, one patrol at a time. As Jason continued his rounds, he caught fragments of whispered conversations from the wounded. They knew exactly where to find us. It's like they had our route memorized. The moon goddess has abandoned us. The last comment hit him like a physical blow. Jason's hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he kept walking. He couldn't afford to show weakness, not when the pack needed him to be strong. But the words echoed in his mind long after he'd left the infirmary. The emergency council meeting convened in the war room, a circular chamber beneath the pack house where generations of alphas had made decisions that shaped their people's fate. Ancient weapons hung on the walls, relics of battles fought and won by leaders who had never faced a threat like this. "We need to consider evacuation," Elder Morrison said, his weathered hands gripping the edge of the table. "Find temporary shelter with the Northern Mountain Pack until this threat passes." "And abandon our territory to rogues?" Councilman Burke shot back, his voice sharp with indignation. "We are Bloodfang. We don't run from fights." "This isn't a fight," interrupted Beta Kane, Jason's second-in-command. "It's a slaughter. They're picking us off one by one, and we can't even find their main force." "Then we seek allies," suggested Councilwoman Reed. "The Eastern Ridge Pack owes us a debt. We could—" "They're 3 days away," Burke cut her off. "We don't have 3 days." The arguments continued, voices rising as fear transformed into anger. Jason sat at the head of the table, listening to his advisors tear each other apart while his pack died around them. Each suggestion was shot down, each plan found lacking. Finally, Elder Morrison spoke the words that made everyone freeze. "There is one option we haven't discussed." The room fell silent. Jason looked up, meeting the old man's steady gaze. "The Omega," Morrison continued quietly. "Sarah Mitchell. She was chosen by the moon goddess. Perhaps she's the key to our salvation." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Burke slammed his fist on the table. "That weak girl. She's probably dead already." "She was the Alpha's true mate," Morrison pressed on. "The ancient laws speak of the power that flows through such bonds. Maybe." "Enough!" Jason's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to him. "Sarah Mitchell is no longer our concern. She chose to leave. We face this threat with the strength we have, not with fantasies about runaway Omegas." But even as he spoke the words, Jason felt them taste like ash in his mouth. Because deep down in the part of his soul he tried to ignore, he knew Morrison was right. Alone in his study, Jason stared at the map spread across his desk. Red pins marked the locations of attacks, creating a pattern that grew more ominous with each passing day. The rogues were tightening their noose, systematically eliminating the pack's outer defenses. His shoulders ached from hunching over the desk, his eyes burned from lack of sleep, and his hands shook from too much coffee and too little food. But he couldn't rest, not when every decision he made could mean the difference between life and death for his people. How did it come to this, he wondered, rubbing his temples against the headache that had been building for days. The answer came unbidden, a memory he'd tried to suppress. Sarah's face during the rejection ceremony. The way her eyes had filled with tears before she shuttered them. The way she'd stood there, broken and beautiful, as his words destroyed everything between them. "I reject you, Sarah Mitchell. You are too weak to stand beside me." Weak, the word haunted him now. Because in the weeks since she'd left, he'd come to realize that she had been anything but weak. She'd been the heart of the pack in ways he'd never understood. The one who tended to the sick, who comforted the grieving, who held them together with quiet strength and unwavering compassion. "And I threw her away," he thought bitterly. "I threw her away because the council convinced me she wasn't strong enough to be Luna. But what kind of strength was I looking for? The kind that leads to this?" He looked around his study, Maps covered in symbols of defeat, reports of casualties, the weight of leadership that seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour. This was what he'd chosen over her. This isolation, this burden, this slow collapse of everything he'd sworn to protect. Maybe I was the weak one, he admitted to himself. Maybe I was the one who wasn't strong enough. The training grounds buzzed with nervous energy as warriors prepared for the next patrol rotation. Jason watched from the observation deck, noting the tension in their movements, the way they kept glancing toward the forest as if expecting attack at any moment. "Alpha's losing his grip," he heard one of them mutter to his partner. "Maybe it's time for new leadership." "Watch your tongue," the other replied, but there was doubt in his voice. "He's kept us safe for years." "Has he? Look around. When's the last time you felt safe?" Jason's hands gripped the railing until his knuckles turned white. Doubt was spreading through the pack like a virus, undermining his authority when he needed it most. He'd built his leadership on strength, on the image of an alpha who never wavered. But now, faced with an enemy he couldn't defeat through conventional means, that image was cracking. "Why isn't he seeking the one the moon goddess chose?" Another voice drifted up from below. "Maybe this is our punishment for rejecting her gift." "Careful," someone warned. "That's treason talk." "Is it? Or is it the truth?" Jason turned away from the conversation, his chest tight with a mixture of anger and guilt. They were right to question him. He'd made his choice based on fear and pride, and now his people were paying the price. That evening, Jason found himself in the practice ring with his beta, working through sword forms that had been ingrained in him since childhood. The familiar motions usually helped clear his mind, but tonight, every swing felt heavy, every block clumsy. "You're distracted," Kane observed, easily deflecting Jason's latest attack. "Your head's not in the fight." "I'm fine," Jason growled, launching into a more aggressive sequence. "You're not fine. You haven't been fine since..." "Since when?" Jason spun around, his sword stopping inches from Kane's throat. "Since I made the decision that everyone said was right? Since I chose duty over sentiment?" Kane didn't flinch. "Since you broke your own heart for the sake of a pack that's now falling apart anyway." The words hit Jason like a physical blow. His control snapped, and he threw his sword aside with enough force to embed it in the wooden wall. "I had no choice," he roared, his voice echoing through the empty training hall. "The council said she was too weak. They said the pack needed a strong Luna. I did what I thought was best." "And how's that working out?" Kane asked quietly. Jason's shoulders sagged as the fight went out of him. "She was never weak, was she?" he whispered. "I was weak. I was the coward who couldn't stand up to the council's pressure." Kane placed a gentle hand on his alpha's shoulder. "It's not too late, Jason. She's still out there. The bond may be broken, but nothing." Jason pulled away, his voice hollow. "She's gone. And even if she wasn't, why would she ever forgive me? I destroyed her in front of the entire pack. I called her weak and cast her aside like she was nothing." "Because she loved you," Kane said simply. "And maybe she still does." Unable to sleep, Jason found himself walking the forest paths that led to the ancient goddess tree, a massive oak that had stood for over 1,000 years, its trunk carved with symbols of protection and wisdom. Previous alphas had come here in times of crisis, seeking guidance from the moon goddess herself. He knelt before the tree, his hands pressed against the rough bark, and for the first time in years he prayed. "I know I've made mistakes," he whispered to the wind. "I know I've failed as an alpha, as a mate, as a man. But please, don't let my people pay for my failures. Show me what to do. Show me how to save them." The wind shifted, rustling through the leaves above, and carried on. That breeze was a scent that made his heart stop. Jasmine and wildflowers, healing herbs, and something indefinably Sarah. "She's alive," he realized, his heart racing. "She's out there, somewhere close." For a moment he felt the phantom pull of the severed mate bond, a whisper of connection that shouldn't exist but somehow did. It was faint, like an echo of an echo, but it was there. And it was calling to him. "Sarah," he breathed, looking toward the deeper forest where her scent seemed to originate. "What have you become?" The scout, who returned the next morning, brought news that changed everything. Marcus Thornfield, the warrior who had been banished 3 years ago for killing a packmate in a dominance challenge, was alive and leading the rogue forces. "He knows all our patrol routes," the scout reported, his voice shaking with exhaustion. "Our safe houses, our weaknesses, everything. He's been planning this for years." Jason felt ice form in his veins. Marcus had been strong, intelligent, and utterly ruthless. He'd been banished not just for the murder, but for the coup attempt that had followed. Now he was back, and he had an army. "There's something else," the scout continued hesitantly. "Someone's been treating the wounded in the outer forest, healing injuries that should have been fatal. The herbs they're using, they're combinations that no one in our pack knows how to make." Jason's heart stopped. "What kind of herbs?" "Moonflower, bloodroot, silverleaf. Ingredients that our healers gave up trying to work with years ago. Whoever's doing this, they have knowledge that goes back generations." Sarah. Her name echoed in Jason's mind like a prayer. She's healing the wounded. Even after everything, she's still trying to save lives. The proof came in his dreams. Though the mate bond had been severed, fragments of it remained like shards of broken glass in his soul. In the space between sleeping and waking, he felt her presence. Silver light and sorrow, power and pain intertwined. He saw her through the dream bond, standing in a moonlit clearing with her hands glowing with healing light. But she was different now, changed in ways that both thrilled and terrified him. There was strength in her posture, authority in her bearing and her eyes. Her eyes held depths that spoke of transformation. "What happened to you?" he wondered, reaching out through the phantom connection. "What have you become?" For a moment he thought she might answer. Her head turned as if she'd heard his voice, and those silver-touched eyes seemed to look directly at him across the impossible distance. Then the dream shattered, leaving him gasping and alone in his empty bed. The message came at dawn, delivered by a rogue who died moments after speaking. It was carved into the messenger's chest, letters etched in blood and pain. "Bow or burn." The pack gathered in the main clearing, their faces pale with shock and fear. Jason stood before them, the weight of leadership crushing down on his shoulders like a physical burden. "Marcus Thornfield wants our submission," he announced, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. "He offers us a choice. Kneel before him, or watch our territory burn." The murmur that rose from the pack was angry, defiant, but Jason could hear the fear underneath. They were brave, but they weren't fools. They knew the odds they faced. "We don't kneel," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "We are Bloodfang. We protect our own, we defend our territory, and we do not bow to those who would destroy us." The cheer that went up was heartfelt but hollow. Jason could see it in their eyes, the knowledge that they were facing an enemy they couldn't defeat, led by an alpha who had already made one catastrophic mistake. How long before they decide I'm not worth following, he wondered. How long before they realize that rejecting Sarah may have doomed us all? The breaking point came that evening. A group of younger wolves confronted Jason in the main hall, their leader a warrior named Trevor who had always been ambitious. "We need new leadership," Trevor announced, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. "An alpha who rejects the moon goddess's will is no alpha at all." "Watch your tongue," Jason warned, but his voice lacked its usual authority. "The pack is dying under your leadership," Trevor continued. "Maybe it's time for someone who won't let pride destroy everything we've built." "And who would that be?" Jason asked quietly. "You? If necessary." The hall fell silent. This was it, the moment Jason had been dreading. The challenge to his authority that would either strengthen his position or destroy it entirely. Any wolf who thinks they can lead better is welcome to try, Jason said, his voice deadly calm. But remember, challenging an alpha means fighting to the death. Are you prepared for that, Trevor? The young warrior's confidence wavered. He was strong, but he wasn't strong enough to face an alpha in single combat. Not yet. I thought not, Jason said, but your point is taken. If my leadership is failing, then I need to find a way to save this pack, whatever it takes. Late that night, Jason stood in his study with Kane, the weight of impossible decisions pressing down on him like a physical burden. The pack is fracturing, Kane observed quietly. If we don't find a solution soon, we'll have civil war on top of everything else. I know. Jason's voice was barely above a whisper. Kane, I need to tell you something. About Sarah. His beta waited patiently as Jason struggled to find the words. She was never weak, Jason finally said. I was weak, for listening to fear instead of fate, for caring more about what the council thought than what my heart knew. I destroyed the best thing that ever happened to me because I was too much of a coward to stand up for what was right. Jason? No. Let me finish. Jason turned away from the window, his face haggard with exhaustion and regret. I've been having dreams. The mate bond. It's not completely severed. I can feel her sometimes, sense her presence. She's different now, Kane. Changed. There's power in her that I never understood. What kind of power? I don't know. But I think she might be the key to saving us all. Kane was quiet for a long moment. So, what are you going to do? Jason looked toward the window, where the first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the sky. Somewhere out there, beyond the forest and the territory lines, was the woman he'd loved and lost. The woman who might be their only hope. I'm going to find her, he said quietly. I'm going to find her and beg her forgiveness. And if she'll have me, if she'll have us, maybe we can save what's left of this pack. And if she won't? Jason was quiet for a long moment, the weight of his failures pressing down on him like a physical burden. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. If I don't find her, we're all already dead. Chapter 6. The Call to Action. The grove called to her one final time. Sarah stood at the edge of the ancient circle, watching the morning mist swirl around the carved stones like living spirits. The runes that had once seemed mysterious now pulsed with familiar energy, responding to her presence like old friends welcoming her home. She stepped forward, placing both hands on the central stone, and let her consciousness open to whatever the ancient magic wanted to show her. The vision hit her with the force of a lightning strike. Fire, smoke choking the sky, the Bloodfang territory burning as rogues poured through broken defenses, warriors falling one by one, their blood soaking into earth that had been their ancestors for generations. And in the center of it all, Jason, wounded, alone, standing over the bodies of his fallen pack members as Marcus Thornfield approached with a cruel smile. You should have knelt when you had the chance, Marcus snarled, raising his claws for the killing blow. The vision shattered, leaving Sarah gasping and shaken. But beneath the horror, she felt something else, a crystalline clarity that cut through every doubt she'd harbored since her awakening. They're going to die, she realized. All of them. Unless... Sarah straightened, her spine finding a steel it had never possessed before. The wind stirred around her, lifting her hair like a dark banner, and when she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had found her true purpose. No more hiding, she whispered to the ancient stones, to the forest, to the part of herself that had spent too long being afraid. No more fear. She moved through her cabin with methodical precision, gathering the tools of her transformation. Herbal salves went into her pack, not just for healing now, but for the enhancement of strength and speed that her new knowledge allowed. The hunting knife her father had given her found its place at her hip, its weight both familiar and reassuring. From the bottom of her mother's trunk, she pulled out a cloak that had belonged to Eleanor Mitchell, midnight blue wool embroidered with silver threads that formed the sigil of their bloodline. A moon surrounded by spiraling stars, the mark of a family that had once been something more than simple pack wolves. Guardians, she remembered from her mother's journal. Protectors of the balance. Sarah fastened the cloak around her shoulders, feeling the weight of legacy settle over her like armor. Each item she gathered was a symbol of her rebirth. From the broken Omega, who had fled into the forest, to the power awakening within her now. Her morning training had become a ritual of transformation. In the clearing behind her cabin, Sarah moved through combat forms that came to her as naturally as breathing. Her body flowed from one stance to another, practicing against shadow opponents that seemed to solidify in the early morning mist. Dodge, strike, counter, flow. Her wolf form rippled in and out of existence as she practiced the shift mid-combat, muscles remembering movements that felt ancient and new at the same time. The awkward, uncertain transformations of her youth were gone, replaced by fluid grace and deadly precision. "This is who I really am," she thought as silver light danced along her skin. "This is who I was always meant to be." When she finally stopped, breathing hard but exhilarated, the sun had fully risen. It was time. While packing her final supplies, Sarah's fingers closed around something small and wooden at the bottom of her travel bag. She pulled it out, her breath catching as she recognized the carved wolf figurine Jason had given her when they were 15. "My father carved this for my mother when they were courting," he'd said, pressing it into her hands after a pack celebration where they danced until dawn. "I want you to have it, for when we're old enough for the moon goddess to bless us." She'd treasured it for years, carrying it everywhere as a symbol of their unspoken bond. Now, looking at the simple wooden carving, she felt nothing. No pain, no longing, no regret, just acknowledgement of what had been. Sarah hesitated for only a moment before placing the figurine in her pack, not as a keepsake of lost love, but as a reminder of the girl she'd been. And how far she'd come since then. Closure, she realized. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But closure. At the edge of her clearing, Sarah caught her reflection in the still water of the stream. The face that looked back at her was transformed, not just by power, but by purpose. Her eyes held depths that spoke of wisdom earned through pain, and her bearing radiated a confidence that would have been impossible weeks ago. The weak Omega is gone, she thought, studying the strong woman in the water. In her place stands someone who chooses her own destiny. She no longer saw weakness when she looked at herself. She saw potential. She saw power. She saw someone who had survived rejection, exile, and transformation to emerge stronger than ever. Let them try to call me weak now. Before leaving, Sarah walked to the great oak tree where she'd buried her pack pendant weeks ago. Using her knife, she carved words into the bark, a message for the forest that had sheltered and healed her. To the sanctuary that gave me strength when I had none, to the silence that taught me to hear my own voice, thank you. I return to the world not as prey, but as the storm. The wind stirred the leaves above her head, and Sarah could have sworn she heard the whisper of ancient voices wishing her well. The journey through the forest was a pilgrimage through memory. Every landmark she passed carried echoes of her past. The cliff where Jason had first kissed her under the stars, the hidden spring where her mother had taught her which herbs could heal and which could harm, the fallen log where she used to sit and dream of a future that seemed bright with possibility. With each step, Sarah felt herself shedding another layer of the pain that had defined her since the rejection. Not forgetting she would never forget, but transforming it into something useful, something powerful. The girl who had walked these paths in heartbreak was gone. The woman who retraced them now walked with purpose and strength that made the very earth seem to acknowledge her presence. As she neared the pack borders, the scents that reached her nose made her blood run cold. Rogue markers, thick and aggressive, layered over the familiar smells of home. Smoke drifted on the wind, not the pleasant wood smoke of hearth fires, but the acrid scent of buildings burning. They're already attacking, she realized, quickening her pace. Her cloak snapped behind her like a battle standard as she ran, no longer caring about stealth or secrecy. She was almost too late. The rogue who tried to intercept her at the border was young and cocky, probably part of a scouting party sent to watch for reinforcements. He stepped out from behind a tree with a sneer, blocking her path. Well, well, what do we have here? A lost little she-wolf? All alone in the big bad forest? Sarah stopped walking but didn't speak. Power hummed beneath her skin, eager to be released. Marcus said we might find strays trying to help their old pack, but don't worry, sweetheart. I'll make this quick. He lunged, claws extended and confidence radiating from every movement. Sarah sidestepped with fluid grace, her hand closing around his throat before he could react. Silver light blazed along her fingers, and the rogue's eyes went wide with terror and recognition. "Tell your leader," she said, her voice deadly calm as she released him, "that the rejected one returns, and she's not the same wolf who left." The rogue scrambled backward, then turned and fled into the forest. Sarah watched him go with grim satisfaction. Let him spread the word. Let them all know she was coming. At the boundary stone that marked the edge of Bloodfang territory, Sarah paused. The last time she'd crossed this threshold, she'd been broken and bleeding, carrying nothing but pain and the clothes on her back. "You are too weak to stand beside me." Jason's words echoed in her memory, as sharp and cutting as they'd been on the night he'd spoken them. For a moment doubt flickered in her chest, the old voice that whispered she wasn't enough, would never be enough. Sarah closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and let the doubt pass through her like wind through grass. "Not anymore," she said aloud, her voice carrying across the empty forest. "Never again." When she opened her eyes, they blazed with silver fire. The moment she crossed into pack territory, the earth itself seemed to recognize her return. Grass straightened beneath her feet, the wind paused as if holding its breath, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, not in challenge, but in recognition of power walking among them. The magic in her bloodline acknowledged this land as hers, not as a subordinate returning home, but as a force of reckoning come to claim what was rightfully hers. "I was born here," she thought, feeling the deep connection to the territory flow through her bones. "I belong here, not as Jason's rejected mate, but as myself. As what I choose to be." The Border Patrol guards saw her coming from 100 yards away. Sarah watched them freeze, their eyes wide with disbelief as they took in her transformed appearance. The confident stride, the midnight cloak, the aura of power that surrounded her like visible heat. "Is that?" one of them whispered. "It can't be," the other replied, but his voice lacked conviction. Sarah walked past them without stopping, without asking permission, without acknowledging their authority to question her presence. Their gasps followed her into the territory, and she knew that within minutes, word of her return would spread through the pack like wildfire. Good, she thought grimly. Let them all know. Let them see what they threw away. As she entered the outer village, heads turned everywhere she looked. Children peeked out from behind their mothers' skirts, their eyes wide with curiosity and awe. Warriors watched from doorways with expressions that ranged from suspicion to wonder. Elders whispered among themselves, their voices carrying fragments of old stories about wolves touched by the moon goddess herself. Sarah didn't look away from any of them. She met their stares with cool confidence, her chin held high and her step never faltering. She had nothing to be ashamed of, nothing to apologize for. She was exactly where she belonged, exactly what she chose to be. The crowd that began to gather in her wake grew larger with each step, but she paid them no attention. Her focus was fixed on the center of the village, where the war tent stood with its banners flying in the wind, where he would be waiting. Jason stepped out of the war tent just as Sarah reached the main square. The sight of him hit her like a physical blow, not with the pain of lost love, but with the stark recognition of how much they'd both changed. He looked older, worn down by the weight of leadership and the burden of his choices. His dark hair was disheveled, his clothes rumpled, and there were deep circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and crushing responsibility. But he was still Jason, still the man who had once been her world before he'd chosen to destroy it. Their eyes met across the square, and Sarah saw the exact moment he recognized her. Shock flashed across his features, followed by something that might have been hope, then a complex mixture of emotions too tangled to name. The entire pack had gone silent, watching this reunion with bated breath. Sarah could feel their collective attention like a weight on her shoulders, but she didn't let it break her stride. She walked to within 10 feet of Jason and stopped, her spine straight and her expression unreadable. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly across the silent square. "I didn't come back for you," she said, her words cutting through the tension like a blade. "I came to protect what you couldn't." Jason's face went white, then red, then settled into something that might have been relief. "Sarah, The rogues will attack at dawn," she continued, not letting him finish. "Marcus Thornfield is leading them, and he has at least 60 fighters. Your current defenses won't hold." "How do you—" "It doesn't matter how I know." Sarah's eyes blazed with silver fire, making several pack members step backward in instinctive fear. "What matters is that in 12 hours, this territory will be under siege. And despite everything that's happened between us, I won't let innocent wolves die because of your pride." She looked around the square, taking in the faces of wolves she'd grown up with, wolves who had dismissed her as weak and worthless. "I'm here to fight," she announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the square. "Not as your alpha's rejected mate, but as a guardian of this land, as someone who chooses to protect what matters regardless of personal cost." The silence that followed was deafening. Then, slowly, a voice called out from the crowd. Elder Morrison, his weathered face creased with something that might have been vindication. "The moon goddess sends her own," he said quietly. "Welcome home, spirit touched." Sarah inclined her head to the old man, then turned back to Jason. The alpha who had broken her heart stood frozen, his mouth slightly open as he struggled to process what he was seeing. "Well?" she asked, her voice cool but not cruel. "Are you going to stand there gaping, or are you going to help me save your pack?" Chapter 7. The battle begins. The ancient warhorn's deep, resonant call shattered the pre-dawn stillness like a hammer blow to glass. Sarah jolted awake in the guest quarters where she'd spent the night, her enhanced senses immediately cataloguing the sounds of panic. Running feet, shouted orders, the metallic scrape of weapons being drawn. "They're here." She was dressed and armed within seconds, her mother's cloak secured around her shoulders as she burst through the door. The village was chaos. Warriors racing toward the borders, elders herding children toward the safe houses, the acrid scent of fear thick in the air. "How many?" she called to a passing warrior. "Dozens, maybe more," he shouted back without stopping. "They hit 3 sectors at once." Sarah's blood ran cold. Marcus wasn't just attacking, he was coordinating a full-scale assault designed to overwhelm their defenses. The pack had prepared for raiders, not a war. The sound of battle reached her ears, the clash of claws on claws, the wet impact of bodies colliding, the primal roars of wolves locked in mortal combat. Without hesitation, Sarah sprinted toward the fighting. The border erupted in savage violence as she approached. Rogues poured through the tree line like a dark tide, their eyes wild with bloodlust, and their coordinated attacks speaking of military precision. They moved in formation, covering each other's flanks, targeting weak points with ruthless efficiency. These aren't desperate outcasts, Sarah realized, watching the assault unfold. These are soldiers. Jason was already in the thick of it, his massive black wolf form a blur of lethal grace as he tore through the enemy ranks. His warriors fought valiantly beside him, but Sarah could see they were being pushed back. The rogues had numbers, coordination, and the element of surprise. Blood painted the snow crimson. Broken branches crackled under the weight of struggling bodies. The air itself seemed to pulse with violence, thick with the scent of death and desperation. "Hold the line," Jason roared, his voice carrying even in wolf form. "Don't let them through." But even as he spoke, Sarah saw their left flank beginning to collapse. A cluster of rogues had broken through, threatening to surround the pack defenders. In minutes, the battle would become a massacre. "Not if I can help it." Sarah burst from the tree line like a force of nature, her midnight cloak streaming behind her as she shifted mid-run. The transformation was seamless, her human form flowing into wolf with an ease that would have been impossible weeks ago. But the wolf that emerged was not the one the pack remembered. Her fur was midnight black, shot through with silver-blue streaks that seemed to move like liquid starlight. Her eyes blazed with white fire, and an ethereal aura surrounded her form, making her appear larger and more imposing than any natural wolf should be. The battlefield went silent for a heartbeat. Rogues and pack members alike stopped fighting, their attention captured by the impossible sight before them. "By the moon goddess," Elder Morrison whispered from the safe zone, his weathered face pale with awe. "We've not seen one like her since the time of the ancients. The old bloodlines walk among us again." Sarah didn't waste time with words. Power flowed through her like liquid lightning, and she channeled it outward in a radiant wave that knocked the breakthrough rogues backward. Light blazed from her form, temporarily blinding her enemies and giving the pack defenders the opening they needed. "Now," she commanded, her voice carrying an authority that came from somewhere deeper than training or experience. "Drive them back!" The pack wolves obeyed without question, their morale restored by her presence. The left flank held. A hulking rogue lieutenant broke away from the main battle, his yellow eyes fixed on Sarah with predatory hunger. He was massive even by rogue standards, his scarred form speaking of countless battles survived. But there was something else about him, an unnatural stillness that made the air around him seem to thicken. "So you're the lost Omega everyone's talking about," he sneered, circling her with the confidence of someone who had never lost a fight. "Marcus will be pleased when I bring him your head." Sarah said nothing, her stance loose and ready. The rogue's size was impressive, but she could read his movements now, the slight favor of his left leg suggesting an old injury, the way his right shoulder dipped indicating a weakness in his guard. "Nothing to say. Good. I like my prey quiet." He lunged with surprising speed, claws extended and fangs bared. Sarah sidestepped at the last moment, her movements so fluid it seemed choreographed. The rogue's momentum carried him past her, and she struck, not with claws but with a focused burst of spiritual energy that sent him crashing into a tree. The impact left a burning sensation along her forearms, and Sarah felt something shift beneath her skin. When she glanced down, she saw new markings blazing faintly beneath her fur, spiral patterns that pulsed with silver light, the price of channeling power beyond mortal limits. "Impossible!" the lieutenant gasped, struggling to rise. "You're just an Omega." "I was never just anything," Sarah replied, her voice deadly calm. "That was your mistake." The second exchange was over before it began. Sarah moved like lightning, her enhanced reflexes making the rogue's attacks seem sluggish. She struck with surgical precision, each blow perfectly placed to maximize damage while minimizing her own exposure. When the lieutenant finally fell, the surrounding rogues stepped backward in instinctive fear. Word spread through their ranks like wildfire. The spirit wolf has returned. The battle raged on, but Sarah's presence had changed everything. She moved through the fighting like a force of nature, appearing wherever the pack's lines were weakest, her power turning the tide in critical moments. Warriors who had once dismissed her as weak now fought beside her with something approaching reverence. When she saved a young wolf from a rogue's killing blow, he stared at her with wide, wondering eyes. "You're really her, aren't you?" he whispered. "The spirit wolf from the old stories." "I'm who I choose to be," Sarah replied, helping him to his feet. "Nothing more, nothing less." A teenage she-wolf named Lyra, barely old enough to fight, had been watching the exchange with rapt attention. When Sarah turned to move on, the girl stepped forward with newfound courage. "I want to be like you," Lyra said, her voice trembling but determined. "I want to be strong like you." Sarah paused, seeing something of her younger self in the girl's desperate hope. "Then be strong, Lyra. Not because someone tells you to, but because you choose to be. That's where real power comes from." The girl nodded solemnly, her spine straightening as she rejoined the fight with renewed purpose. Sarah watched her go, knowing she'd just planted a seed that would grow into something extraordinary. An older warrior, one who had laughed when Jason rejected her, bowed his head in shame as she passed. "We were wrong," he said quietly. "Forgive us." Sarah paused, meeting his eyes with a gaze that held no anger, only understanding. "Fight well today. That's all the forgiveness I need." From across the battlefield, Jason watched in stunned disbelief as Sarah single-handedly turned the tide of battle. The woman he had rejected as too weak was decimating rogue formations with a combination of tactical brilliance and raw power that left him breathless. "What have I done?" he thought, his chest tight with a mixture of awe and crushing guilt. "What did I throw away?" He saw her coordinate a flanking maneuver that trapped a squad of rogues between two groups of pack warriors. He watched her channel power into a protective barrier that saved 3 wounded wolves from a rogue charge. He witnessed her move with a grace and authority that made his own leadership look clumsy by comparison. This was what the moon goddess had intended for them. Not him alone, but them together. Sarah wasn't meant to be a weak Luna hiding in his shadow. She was meant to be an equal partner, a force of nature in her own right. And I was too blind to see it. When the pack's eastern flank collapsed entirely, Sarah didn't hesitate. She raised her voice above the chaos, her commands cutting through the din of battle like a blade through silk. "7th Squad, fall back to the secondary line. 4th and 9th, cover their retreat. Everyone else, form up on me." The warriors obeyed without question, their training overriding their surprise at taking orders from the formerly rejected Omega. Sarah's voice carried an authority that felt divinely inspired, not the harsh command of a tyrant, but the guidance of someone who genuinely cared about their survival. "She's a natural leader," Jason heard one of his lieutenants whisper. "Look how they respond to her." Jason looked, and his heart clenched with the bitter recognition of what he'd lost. This was what Sarah had always been. Not a weakness to be overcome, but a strength he'd been too proud to recognize. The turning point came when Sarah and Jason found themselves back-to-back in a circle of enemies, surrounded by rogues who had broken through the main line. For a moment, time seemed to slow as they faced the overwhelming odds. Then their wolves moved in perfect synchronization, not from planning or coordination, but from instinct deeper than thought. They flowed around each other like dancers, Jason's raw power complementing Sarah's tactical precision, her spiritual energy enhancing his physical strength. "This is what we were meant to be," Jason realized as they fought side by side. "This is what I destroyed." Sarah seemed to sense his thoughts. Their eyes met for a brief moment between strikes, and he saw something in her gaze. Not forgiveness, but acknowledgement, recognition of what they had been, what they could have been, what they were in this moment despite everything that had happened between them. "Left!" she called, and he turned to block a rogue's attack he hadn't seen coming. "Behind you!" he shouted, and she spun to catch a threat aimed at her blind spot. They moved as one, their bond reformed in battle if not in heart. The rogues around them began to falter, unnerved by the deadly partnership they faced. Sarah's final howl rang across the battlefield like the voice of the moon goddess herself. Pure, powerful, and filled with spiritual energy that made the very air shimmer. The sound cut through the chaos of battle, carrying notes of authority and divine power that struck terror into the hearts of their enemies. But the effort cost her. The glowing marks on her arms blazed brighter, and Sarah felt something deep within her core shift permanently. Power had a price, and she had just paid it. The rogues' formation broke instantly. Those who could fled into the forest, their earlier confidence shattered by the force they had not expected to face. Those who couldn't retreat quickly enough found themselves surrounded by pack warriors whose morale had been restored by Sarah's presence. From the tree line, Marcus Thornfield stepped partially into view, his massive form radiating an aura of controlled menace. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the battlefield, not shouting but projecting with the confidence of someone who had planned for this moment. Impressive, Carter. But you think this was war? His laugh was cold, calculating. This was merely me testing your walls. Now I know exactly where they break. Sarah turned toward his voice, her eyes blazing with silver fire, but Marcus continued with chilling certainty. Enjoy your small victory when I return. And I will return. I'll bring enough force to turn your territory into a graveyard. The Spirit Wolf's tricks won't save you when I come, with an army that blocks out the sun. He stepped back into the shadows, but his final words carried on the wind. Tell the pack to remember this day. It's the last time they'll taste victory. The threat hung in the air like a curse, but Sarah's voice rang out in response, carrying to every corner of the battlefield. Run while you still can, Marcus, because next time, I won't be holding back. As the battlefield settled into an eerie quiet, the full scope of what had transpired began to sink in. Pack members moved among the wounded and dead, their voices hushed with the reverence of those who had witnessed something extraordinary. Sarah stood at the center of it all, her midnight cloak stirring in the breeze as she surveyed the aftermath. Blood stained her fur, and the silver marks on her arms still glowed faintly beneath her skin, permanent reminders of the power she had channeled. One by one, the pack members began to approach her. Warriors bowed their heads in respect. Elders whispered prayers of gratitude. Young wolves looked at her with wonder and awe. You saved us, someone whispered from the crowd. The Spirit Wolf has returned, another voice added. Elder Morrison approached slowly, his weathered face creased with something between awe and ancient knowledge. Child, he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of prophecy, you are the fulfillment of legends we thought lost forever. The bloodlines of the ancients run true in you. Sarah accepted their reverence with quiet dignity, but her eyes remained fixed on the tree line where Marcus had disappeared. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. The rogue leader would regroup, plan and return with an even larger force. This was just the beginning. Jason approached slowly, his human form restored but his expression heavy with the weight of everything he'd witnessed. He stopped a few feet away, his mouth opening as if to speak, then closing again as words failed him. You saved us, he finally managed, his voice rough with emotion. We. Thank you. Sarah turned to face him, her expression unreadable. I didn't do it for you, she said quietly. I did it because it was right. The simple words hit Jason like a physical blow. He nodded slowly, understanding flooding his features. I know. That's what makes it so much worse. Around them, the pack continued their grim work of tending the wounded and counting the dead. But Sarah's attention was already turning to the future, to the next attack, the next battle, the war that would determine whether the Bloodfang Pack survived or fell to Marcus's ambition. This isn't over, she said, her voice carrying to the entire pack. He'll be back with more fighters, better planning. We need to be ready. What do you suggest? Jason asked, his tone carefully neutral. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, then turned to address the pack as a whole. We prepare. We train. We remember that strength isn't just about power. It's about standing together when everything falls apart. Her eyes swept across the assembled wolves, taking in their battered but determined faces. Today, we proved we're more than they thought we were. Tomorrow, we'll prove we're stronger than they can imagine. The pack's answering roar of agreement echoed across the battlefield, a sound of defiance that carried far into the forest. Somewhere in the darkness, Marcus Thornfield heard it and smiled, not with fear, but with the anticipation of a predator who had finally found worthy prey. The spirit wolf had returned and everything had changed. Chapter 8. Confrontation. The battlefield fell into an eerie lull, as if the moon goddess herself had called for a moment of reckoning. Smoke drifted between the trees like ghostly fingers, and the scent of blood hung heavy in the air. Through the haze of battle's aftermath, two figures stood frozen in recognition. Sarah felt the weight of Jason's stare before she saw him. Her enhanced senses picked up the sudden spike in his heartbeat, the sharp intake of breath that spoke of shock and something deeper. When she finally turned to face him across the clearing, time seemed to fracture around them. Here we are, she thought, studying the man who had once been her entire world. Full circle. Jason stood 20 feet away, his massive frame heaving with exhaustion, his dark eyes wide with an emotion she couldn't quite name. He looked older, worn down by leadership and loss, marked by the weight of decisions that had brought them to this moment. But beneath the Alpha's facade, she saw something she'd never expected to see again. Vulnerability. The shift from wolf to human happened simultaneously, as if they'd planned it. Sarah felt her bones reshape themselves with fluid grace, her enhanced abilities making the transformation seamless. When she straightened to her full height, she was acutely aware of how different she must look to him. Gone was the trembling Omega who had fled into the forest weeks ago. In her place stood a woman forged by trial and transformation, her spine straight with hard-earned confidence, her eyes holding depths that spoke of power claimed rather than given. Jason's transformation was less smooth, his exhaustion showing in the way he stumbled slightly as he regained human form. Blood streaked his chest from a shallow wound, and his hair was matted with sweat and dirt. But his eyes, those dark eyes that had once held her entire future, never left her face. Sarah, he breathed, her name falling from his lips like a prayer. She said nothing, simply met his gaze with the steady composure of someone who had learned to stand in her own strength. The silence stretched between them, filled with everything they'd never said and might never say. "I didn't know," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "You didn't want to know," Sarah interrupted, her tone neither cruel nor kind, simply honest. "There's a difference." The words hit Jason like physical blows, bringing with them a cascade of memories he'd tried to suppress. Sarah at 15, quietly tending to an injured pup, while the other young wolves played. Sarah at 17, staying up all night to help his sister through a difficult fever. Sarah at 19, looking at him with such love and trust that it had terrified him. How could I have been so blind, he wondered, watching her now radiating power and purpose in equal measure. But Sarah was having her own flashback, remembering the night that had changed everything. "You are too weak to stand beside me. I reject you, Sarah Mitchell, as my mate and future Luna." The cold finality in his voice, the way he'd looked through her rather than at her, the sound of her heart breaking so loudly she was surprised the entire pack couldn't hear it. The memory hung between them like smoke from a dying fire, acrid, painful, impossible to ignore. A howl pierced the air, followed by the thunder of paws against earth. The second wave was coming, larger and more coordinated than the first. Marcus had regrouped faster than expected. "Move!" Sarah commanded, and Jason found himself obeying without question. They fell into position instinctively, their bodies remembering the countless hours they'd spent training together as teenagers. Sarah flowed to his left side while Jason covered her right flank, a formation they'd perfected years ago, but never expected to use again. The rogues hit them like an avalanche of fur and fury, but Jason and Sarah moved as one entity. When he blocked, she struck. When she created an opening, he capitalized on it. Their fighting styles complemented each other with a precision that spoke of bonds deeper than conscious thought. This, Jason realized as they danced through the chaos. This is what we were meant to be. Sarah felt it too. The way their rhythms synchronized, the way they anticipated each other's movements without communication. It should have felt natural, comforting. Instead, it felt like mourning for what might have been. The rogue came at Jason from his blind spot, moving with the deadly silence of a practiced killer. By the time Jason sensed the threat, it was too late to dodge. Time slowed as he saw death approaching in the form of extended claws and bared fangs. The energy blast hit the rogue mid-leap, sending him flying backward into a tree with enough force to snap the trunk. Silver light blazed around Sarah's form as she lowered her hands, her eyes blazing with protective fury. Jason stared at her in stunned silence, his heart racing from both the near-death experience and the realization of what she'd done. She had saved him. After everything he'd put her through, she had saved his life without hesitation. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Because it was the right thing to do." The simple words cut deeper than any accusation could have. The remaining rogues had scattered, giving them a moment to regroup behind the cover of a massive oak tree. Jason slumped against the bark, his breath coming in harsh gasps as adrenaline began to fade. "You were never weak," he said suddenly, the words torn from somewhere deep in his chest. I was the weak one." Sarah studied his face, looking for deception or manipulation. She found only raw honesty and a pain that seemed to echo her own. "Then why?" she asked. "If you knew that, why did you do it?" Jason closed his eyes, his shoulders sagging under the weight of confession. "Because the council convinced me that strength looked like something else. Because I was terrified of appearing vulnerable. Because I was a coward who chose politics over my heart." "You broke me," Sarah said quietly, her voice steady but filled with a pain that time hadn't dulled. "You took everything I was, everything I believed about myself, and you shattered it in front of the entire pack." Jason flinched as if she'd struck him, but she wasn't finished. "But here's what you need to understand. I rebuilt myself. Stone by stone, piece by piece, I put myself back together. And when I was done, I was stronger than I ever was before. Not because of you, but despite you. Not with your help, but without it." Her eyes blazed with silver fire as she continued. "The woman standing here now, she doesn't need your validation. She doesn't need your pack's acceptance. She doesn't need anything from you except honesty." The words hung in the air between them, beautiful and terrible in their truth. For the first time in his adult life, Jason let his alpha mask fall completely. The facade of unshakable confidence crumbled, revealing the man beneath, flawed, regretful, and desperately trying to find his way back to something he'd thrown away. "The council pressured me for months," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "They said Aluna needed to be intimidating, politically savvy, capable of matching my strength blow for blow. They painted you as a liability, too gentle, too kind, too human," Sarah supplied. "Too good for the ugly realities of leadership," Jason finished. "They convinced me that love wasn't enough, that I needed a partner who could rule through fear rather than compassion. And like a fool, I listened." He looked at her with eyes full of anguish. "I told myself I was protecting you from a life you weren't suited for. But the truth is, I was protecting myself from having to fight for you, from having to stand up to them and defend what we had." Sarah felt something shift in her chest. Not forgiveness, but understanding. The anger that had sustained her through weeks of exile began to transform into something more complex, more mature. "You were afraid," she said, and it wasn't a question. "Terrified," Jason confirmed, "of being seen as weak, of making decisions based on emotion rather than logic, of letting the pack down." "So you let me down instead?" "So I let you down instead," he agreed, his voice heavy with self-loathing. For a moment they simply looked at each other, Two people who had loved deeply and lost catastrophically, trying to navigate the wreckage of what they'd been. Then Jason did something that surprised them both. He reached out, his fingers barely brushing her arm in a gesture so hesitant it was almost reverent. Sarah flinched at the contact, but didn't pull away. The touch sent electricity racing through her system, not the spiritual energy she'd grown accustomed to, but something older and more dangerous. The phantom echo of a bond that had been severed but not entirely destroyed. "I know I have no right," Jason whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I know I destroyed any claim I had to your affection. But Sarah, seeing you like this, seeing what you've become—" "What?" she asked when he trailed off. "You're magnificent," he breathed. "You're everything I was too blind to see before. And losing you, it's the biggest mistake of my life." A low growl rumbled through the forest, followed by the sound of deliberate footsteps. Marcus Thornfield emerged from the shadows with a cadre of elite rogues, his scarred face twisted in a sneer of contempt. "How touching," he drawled, his voice dripping with mockery. "The rejected mates having a reunion. Should I give you a moment to finish your little heart-to-heart?" Sarah and Jason sprang apart, their personal drama forgotten in the face of immediate danger. But something had changed between them. A understanding had been reached, even if forgiveness hadn't been granted. "I was wondering when you'd show yourself," Sarah replied coolly, power beginning to gather around her like visible heat. "Hiding in the shadows suits you." Marcus's expression darkened. "Clever little Omega. But let's see how clever you are when you're outnumbered 10-1. The elite rogues spread out in perfect formation, their movements speaking of military training and deadly purpose. These weren't the desperate outcasts from the first wave. These were Marcus's inner circle, wolves who had chosen to follow him, not from desperation but from shared bloodlust. "Ready?" Jason asked quietly, settling into a combat stance. "Always," Sarah replied, and for the first time since her return, there was warmth in her voice when she spoke to him. The battle that followed was unlike anything either of them had experienced. Where the earlier fighting had been chaotic and desperate, this was a dance of death performed by masters of their craft. Jason fought with the brutal efficiency of an alpha protecting his territory, his movements powerful and direct. But Sarah fought like poetry written in violence, her spiritual energy weaving through her physical attacks in patterns that seemed to bend reality itself. They moved together now, not as former lovers trying to recapture the past, but as equals acknowledging each other's strength. Jason's raw power provided the foundation, while Sarah's tactical brilliance and mystical abilities provided the strategy. When Marcus himself entered the fray, targeting Sarah with obvious intent to eliminate the spirit wolf threat, Jason was there to intercept. When a rogue lieutenant tried to flank Jason during his engagement with Marcus, Sarah's energy blast sent the attacker sprawling. "You cannot win," Marcus snarled as he found himself driven back by their combined assault. "I have armies at my disposal. This is only the beginning." "Then bring them," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had found her true power. "We'll be ready." Marcus's eyes burned with frustrated rage as he signaled his remaining forces to retreat. "This isn't over, Carter. And when I return, I'll make sure to save the spirit wolf for last, so she can watch everything she's trying to protect burn to ash." With that chilling promise, he vanished back into the forest, leaving behind only the scent of malice and the promise of future violence. In the aftermath of battle, Jason and Sarah stood among the fallen leaves and scattered debris, both breathing hard but undefeated. The immediate threat had passed, but the larger war loomed before them like a storm on the horizon. Jason turned to face her, his expression serious but no longer hopeless. The man who had been broken by guilt and regret was still there, but he was beginning to remember how to be strong, not through dominance but through purpose. "When this is over," he said quietly, his voice carrying across the space between them, "I need to tell you everything, the whole truth. Not just the parts that make me look less guilty." Sarah studied his face for a long moment, seeing sincerity where once there had been only pride. She couldn't offer forgiveness, not yet, possibly not ever. But she could offer something else. "You'll need more than words, Jason," she replied, her tone neither cruel nor kind. "If you want any chance of redemption, you'll need to prove that you've actually changed, that you're capable of being the man you should have been all along." "I understand," he said simply, "and I'll spend as long as it takes proving that I can be worthy of a second chance." Sarah nodded once, then turned toward the territory's heart where wounded pack members needed her healing skills. She'd taken 3 steps when Jason's voice stopped her. "Sarah?" She looked back over her shoulder, her expression carefully neutral. "For what it's worth, I'm proud of you, of who you've become. The pack is lucky to have you fighting for them." Something flickered in Sarah's eyes, surprise perhaps, or the ghost of old affection. "I'm not fighting for the pack, Jason. I'm fighting for what's right. There's a difference." With that, she walked away, leaving Jason alone with his thoughts and the weight of promises he wasn't sure he'd be able to keep. But for the first time since the rejection, he felt something other than despair. He felt hope. Chapter 9. Redemption. Dawn broke over the Bloodfang territory like a benediction, painting the battlefield in shades of gold and amber that seemed too gentle for a place that had seen so much violence. The scent of smoke still lingered in the air, but it was beginning to fade beneath the stronger perfume of healing herbs and morning dew. Sarah stood at the edge of the forest, her midnight cloak draped around her shoulders as she watched the sunrise paint the sky. The silver marks on her arms had dulled to faint scars, but she could still feel the power thrumming beneath her skin, quieter now but forever changed. The pack moved behind her in hushed efficiency. The wounded were being tended in the makeshift infirmary, the dead were being prepared for their final journey, and the business of survival continued with the grim determination of those who had faced annihilation and lived. But in this moment, Sarah allowed herself to simply be still, to breathe, to wonder if the moon goddess had truly severed their bond, or if something deeper was slowly being reforged in the crucible of shared battle and mutual recognition. "I'm not the same person who left," she reflected, watching a hawk circle overhead. "But I'm not sure who I am now either." From across the camp, Jason watched her with the careful attention of someone studying a masterpiece he'd once owned and foolishly destroyed. She moved through the recovery efforts like a force of nature, gentle with the wounded, authoritative with the warriors, radiating a quiet strength that drew people to her like moths to flame. "She doesn't need me," he realized with a mixture of pride and devastating loss. "She never did. I just convinced myself she was weak because it made me feel strong." Elder Hawthorne approached, his weathered face creased with concern. "Alpha, the pack is restless. There are questions about leadership, about the future." "What kind of questions?" Jason asked, though he already knew. "Some wonder if the moon goddess sent her back to replace you. Others whisper that you should step aside willingly." The elder's voice was carefully neutral, but his meaning was clear. Jason's jaw tightened. "And what do you think, Hawthorne?" "I think a leader who can admit his mistakes and learn from them is rarer than one who never makes them at all," the elder replied. "But admission isn't enough. The pack needs to see change, not just hear promises." The words stung because they were true. Jason had spent years building his reputation as an unshakable alpha, but that facade had crumbled the moment he'd let fear override his heart. His first attempt at conversation came later that morning, when he found Sarah tending to a wounded pup in the healing tent. Her hands glowed with gentle silver light as she worked, her touch coaxing damaged tissue back to wholeness with a skill that went beyond mere training. "Sarah," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. She paused in her work but didn't turn around. The pup beneath her hands stirred restlessly, sensing the tension in the air. "I wanted to thank you," Jason continued when she didn't respond. For what you did yesterday, for saving us, for saving me. You don't owe me anything, Sarah replied, her voice carefully neutral. She completed the healing and gently covered the sleeping pup with a blanket. I did what needed to be done. She moved toward the tent's exit, clearly intending to end the conversation there. Jason wanted to reach for her, to force her to face him, but he held himself back. She had given him no right to demand her attention. Sarah, please. Please what? She finally turned, and the carefully controlled expression on her face was harder to bear than anger would have been. Please pretend that everything is forgiven. Please act like we can go back to the way things were. No, Jason said quietly. I need you to know that I understand what I lost, what I threw away. Sarah studied his face for a long moment, searching for something he wasn't sure he possessed. Do you? She asked, because understanding and changing are two different things. With that, she walked away, leaving Jason alone with the sleeping pup and the weight of his failures. That evening, Jason sat at his desk for the first time in weeks, an old leather journal open before him. He'd started keeping it as a young alpha, documenting pack decisions and strategic thoughts. But somewhere along the way, it had become something else, a place for the thoughts he couldn't share with anyone else. Day 1. After the battle, he wrote, his handwriting shakier than it used to be. I watched her today. Not like a predator watching prey, but like a man trying to understand a masterpiece he once held and carelessly destroyed. She moves through the pack like she was born to lead them, and maybe she was. Maybe that's what I never understood. That the moon goddess didn't give her to me as a prize to be won. She gave her to me as an equal to be cherished. The elders question my leadership. They're not wrong to doubt. How can I protect them when I couldn't even protect the most precious thing in my life? How can I lead with wisdom when I've proven myself capable of such profound stupidity? She asked me if I would still want her if she had remained weak. The question haunts me because I don't know the answer. Or maybe I do, and I'm too much of a coward to face it. I need to do better. Not for the pack, not for my position as alpha, but for her. Because she deserves better than the man I've been. The next morning brought a confrontation Jason had been dreading. Elder Blackwood, the most conservative member of the council, cornered him near the armory. This has gone far enough, Blackwood said without preamble. The pack looks to that Omega for leadership while you moon over her like a lovesick pup. It's unseemly. Her name is Sarah, Jason replied coldly. And she saved this pack when our traditional leadership failed. She's a disruption, Blackwood continued. The natural order exists for a reason. An alpha leads, his lunar supports. Not this equal partnership nonsense. The natural order nearly got us all killed, Jason shot back. My pride, my adherence to your precious traditions, my refusal to value her counsel, that's what left us vulnerable. You cannot seriously be considering... I'm considering what's best for the pack, Jason interrupted. And what's best is acknowledging that strength comes in many forms. Sarah proved that. Blackwood's face flushed with anger. Mark my words, Alpha. This path leads to chaos. The pack will fragment, other territories will see us as weak, and everything we've built will crumble. Then we'll rebuild it better, Jason replied. Stronger, more inclusive, more honest about where real power lies. The elder stalked away, muttering about modern nonsense and the old ways. But Jason felt strangely lighter. For the first time in months, he'd stood up for what he believed in, rather than what was expected of him. Sarah found her own moments of reflection in the healing grove, where the ancient rune stones still pulsed with gentle energy. She came here when the weight of everyone's expectations became too much, when the reverent looks and whispered prayers about the spirit wolf threatened to overwhelm her sense of self. Who am I now, she wondered, running her fingers over the carved symbols. The rejected Omega is gone. The broken girl who fled into the forest is gone. But who took their place? The transformation had given her power, respect, purpose, but it had also left her adrift in ways she hadn't expected. The pack looked at her with awe now, but sometimes she missed being seen as simply Sarah, flawed, ordinary human Sarah. As her fingers traced the ancient runes, she felt something stir within her, not just the power she'd grown accustomed to, but something deeper. The faintest whisper of connection, as if invisible threads were slowly weaving themselves back together. Is this what healing feels like, she wondered? Not just forgiving him, but forgiving myself for believing I was ever as weak as he made me feel? The runestone pulsed brighter, as if responding to her thoughts. In its glow, Sarah saw not just her own reflection, but the shadow of what she and Jason had been, and perhaps what they could become again. She was preparing healing supplies in the tent when he appeared at the entrance, silhouetted against the late evening sky. Sarah didn't look up from her work, but she was acutely aware of his presence, the way he hesitated at the threshold, as if asking permission to enter. "May I come in?" he asked quietly. Sarah gestured to a chair without looking up. "It's your territory." "No," Jason said, stepping inside but remaining standing. "It's yours. This whole tent, everything you've built here, it's yours. I have no right to it unless you give it to me." Something in his tone made her finally look up. Jason stood in the center of the tent, but his posture was different, smaller somehow despite his impressive frame. His head was bowed, his hands clasped in front of him like a supplicant seeking absolution. "What are you doing?" she asked, confused by the display. "I'm kneeling," Jason said simply. And then he did, dropping to his knees on the soft earth floor. Not as an alpha, not as a leader, as a man who failed you, as someone who broke the most precious thing he ever had and is trying to figure out how to live with that knowledge. Sarah stared at him, shocked into silence. She'd never seen Jason kneel to anyone or anything. The gesture was so unprecedented that she couldn't immediately process it. "I failed you," he continued, his voice rough with emotion. "Not just in the rejection, not just in that one moment. I failed your heart, Sarah. I failed to see your worth, to protect your feelings, to be the man you deserved. I failed in every way that mattered." Sarah set down her supplies and studied his face, searching for manipulation or performance. She found only raw honesty and a pain that seemed to match her own. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why was I never enough until I became powerful? Would you still want me if I had stayed weak?" The questions hung in the air like accusations. Jason's face crumpled, and for the first time since she'd known him, Sarah saw him cry. Not the angry tears of frustration or rage, but the broken tears of genuine grief. "I don't know," he whispered, and the honesty of it cut deeper than any lie could have. "I want to say yes, but I don't know if that's true or if it's just what I want to believe about myself. And that makes me sick." He looked up at her with eyes full of anguish. "You were always enough, Sarah. You were everything. But I was too weak to see it, too concerned with what others thought to trust my own heart. I let fear make me into a coward, and I hurt the one person who deserved my protection." Sarah felt something shift in her chest, not forgiveness but understanding. The anger she'd carried for so long began to transform into something more complex, more nuanced. "You broke me," she said quietly. "But you also freed me. Because when I rebuilt myself, I built something stronger. Someone who doesn't need your validation to know her worth." "I know," Jason replied. "And that's the most beautiful and terrible thing about what you've become. You don't need me anymore. Maybe you never did." "Even broken, the bond pulls at me," Jason admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I dream of you every night. I ache when you're near and ache worse when you're not. I know I have no right to feel this way, no claim on your affections, but I can't make it stop." He looked at her with desperate honesty. "I never stopped loving you, Sarah. I was just too much of a coward to fight for you when it mattered. Too concerned with appearing weak to the council to defend what was strong between us. Sarah felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crack, not crumbling but developing hairline fractures that let in small slivers of light. Love isn't enough, she said, but her voice was gentler than it had been. Love didn't stop you from destroying me. Love didn't make you stand up to the council. Love didn't save us. No, Jason agreed. It didn't. Because I was weak, and I let fear be stronger than love. But maybe if you could find it in your heart to give me a chance, just a chance, I could prove that I've learned, that I can be better. Sarah studied his face for a long moment, seeing sincerity where once there had been only pride. She couldn't offer forgiveness, not yet, possibly not ever. But for the first time since returning, she found herself considering the possibility that people could change. Maybe, she said softly, but it would have to be earned, day by day, choice by choice. Trust isn't given freely after it's been broken. It has to be rebuilt from the ground up. The next morning brought an unexpected development. Sarah was reviewing the pack's defenses when a messenger approached, breathless from running. "The Alpha requests your presence in the main hall," the young wolf panted. "He's calling an emergency pack meeting." Sarah arrived to find the entire pack assembled, their faces reflecting confusion and curiosity. Jason stood at the front of the hall, his expressions serious but determined. Elder Blackwood sat in the front row, his disapproval radiating like heat from a forge. "Pack members," Jason began, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "Recent events have made it clear that our leadership structure needs to evolve. We face threats that require more than traditional strength to overcome." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Sarah felt a chill of apprehension. "Therefore," Jason continued, "I am announcing the appointment of Sarah Mitchell as co-leader of our strategic council. She will have equal authority in all matters of pack defense and external relations." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Some pack members cheered, others looked shocked, and several voices rose in protest. "She's not even a proper pack member anymore," Elder Blackwood stood, his voice carrying across the hall. "This is unprecedented," another elder added. "The traditions exist for a reason." "What traditions?" Jason's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "The traditions that left us vulnerable to attack? The traditions that nearly got us all killed?" The hall fell silent, tension crackling in the air. Sarah Mitchell earned this position through her actions, not her bloodline or her connections, Jason continued. She saved this pack when our traditional leadership, when I, failed to protect what mattered. She proved that strength comes in many forms and that wisdom doesn't require a title to be valid. He looked directly at Blackwood. "If anyone has objections to being led by someone with proven courage and tactical brilliance, they're welcome to leave. But they'll be leaving without the protection of someone who has already died for this pack and come back stronger." Sarah stared at him in shock, recognizing the enormous risk he'd just taken. By publicly elevating her to leadership, he was essentially acknowledging that she was his equal, something that went against every traditional pack hierarchy. "Furthermore," Jason continued, his voice ringing with conviction, "anyone who wishes to question her authority is questioning mine, because I chose her, and I stand by that choice completely." Young Marcus, who had fought bravely in the battle, stood up. "I support this decision. Sarah saved my life, and the lives of many others. She's earned the right to lead." Other voices joined in, warriors who had fought beside her, families she had healed, young wolves who saw in her a different kind of strength. The tide of opinion began to turn. Elder Blackwood's face flushed with anger. "This is madness. You're destroying everything we've built." "No," Jason replied calmly. "I'm building something better. Something that honors strength in all its forms, not just the kind that can be measured in dominance displays." That evening, they found themselves walking through the old training grounds where they'd spent countless hours as teenagers. The space felt smaller now, touched by memory and regret. "Do you remember the first time we sparred here?" Jason asked, stopping near the weapons rack they'd used hundreds of times. "You threw me into the mud," Sarah replied, a hint of warmth creeping into her voice. "Then you helped me up and apologized for the next hour." "You were so determined to prove you could fight," Jason remembered. "I was trying to go easy on you, but you called me out for it. Said you'd rather lose honestly than win because I was patronizing you." "I meant it then," Sarah said. "I mean it now." Jason pulled something from his pocket, the carved wooden wolf he'd given her when they were children. Sarah's breath caught as she recognized it. "You kept it," she whispered. "I found it in your things after you left," Jason admitted. "I've carried it ever since, a reminder of what I lost when I lost you." He held it out to her, his hands trembling slightly. "I don't want power, Sarah. I don't want to be alpha of anything if it means being without you. I want peace. I want to wake up every morning knowing I'm worthy of the woman beside me." Sarah took the carving, her fingers brushing his briefly in the exchange. The contact sent electricity through both of them, not the spiritual energy she'd grown accustomed to, but something older and more dangerous. For just a moment she felt it, the faintest whisper of their old bond, not broken but transformed. "This doesn't fix everything," she said, looking down at the small wooden wolf. "This doesn't erase what happened." "I know," Jason replied. "I'm not asking you to forget. I'm asking for the chance to do better." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, weighing his words against his actions, his promises against his past failures. In the growing twilight, she could see the rune stones glow from the healing grove, pulsing with the same rhythm as her heartbeat. "I'm not ready to forgive you," she said honestly. "I may never be ready. Love doesn't fix betrayal, Jason. Time might. Actions will." He nodded, accepting her words without argument. "But," Sarah continued, "I'm willing to see who you become. Not who you were, not who you promised to be, but who you actually are when faced with difficult choices. If you want me back, if you want us back, you'll have to prove it. Day by day, choice by choice, moment by moment." "How will I know if I'm succeeding?" Jason asked. Sarah smiled, not with joy but with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had found her power and intended to use it wisely. "You'll know," she said, "because I'll tell you." That night, under the gentle light of the full moon, they sat together on the steps of the pack house, not touching, not embracing, but sharing the same space for the first time since her return without the weight of immediate crisis between them. "This isn't the end, Jason," Sarah said softly, her eyes fixed on the stars above. "It's not a happy ending or a guarantee of anything. It's just the beginning. Maybe." As if drawn by forces beyond their control, their hands moved closer together on the stone steps. Not quite touching, but close enough to feel the warmth of the other's skin. For just a moment, Jason's fingertips brushed against hers, the barest whisper of contact that sent shockwaves through both of them. The phantom mate bond flared to life just for an instant, reminding them of what they'd once shared and hinting at what might be possible again. Sarah pulled her hand away, but gently. The gesture wasn't rejection. It was protection. For both of them. "Maybe," she repeated, the word carrying more weight than any promise. "But only if you prove that the man kneeling in my tent is who you really are. Not just when you're desperate, but when you're comfortable, when you're challenged, when you're afraid." Jason nodded, understanding that maybe was more than he deserved and more than he dared hope for. It wasn't love, it wasn't forgiveness, but it was possibility. And for now, possibility was enough. From the shadows of the pack house, Elder Blackwood watched the exchange with narrowed eyes. Change was coming whether he liked it or not, but perhaps there were ways to ensure it came on his terms. The game was far from over. Chapter 10. A new beginning. 3 weeks after the battle, the Bloodfang territory bore little resemblance to the war zone it had once been. Where broken trees had fallen, new saplings were already taking root. Where blood had stained the earth, wildflowers bloomed in defiant clusters of purple and gold. The pack had learned something profound in those dark hours, that true strength lay not in avoiding destruction, but in rising from it more beautiful than before. Sarah walked through the rebuilding efforts with quiet satisfaction, watching pack members work side by side regardless of rank or bloodline. The rigid hierarchies that had once defined their society were softening, replaced by something more organic, more honest. A wolf's worth was now measured by their contributions, not their connections. Change, she reflected, is never as impossible as those in power make it seem. Young wolves who had once whispered cruel jokes about the weak Omega now sought her guidance on everything from combat techniques to healing arts. Warriors twice her age deferred to her tactical expertise during strategy meetings. Healers asked to study under her, eager to learn the fusion of traditional medicine and spiritual energy that had saved so many lives. "Sarah," called Lyra, the teenage she-wolf who had shown such courage during the battle. "Could you look at Marcus? His shoulder wound isn't healing properly." Sarah nodded, following the girl to where the young warrior sat, wincing near the practice rings. As she worked, her hands glowing with gentle silver light, she was aware of the circle of wolves watching her with respectful attention. Once such scrutiny would have made her nervous. Now it simply felt natural. "How did you know?" Marcus asked as the pain faded from his expression. "That you were strong, I mean, before the powers came." Sarah paused in her work, considering the question. "I didn't know. For the longest time I believed what others told me about my weakness. But strength isn't about never falling down. It's about choosing to get back up, even when no one believes you can." The transformation in Jason was perhaps even more remarkable than the physical rebuilding around them. Gone was the alpha who had ruled through dominance and fear of appearing weak. In his place stood a leader who listened more than he spoke, who credited others for successes and took responsibility for failures. Sarah watched him during council meetings, noting how he made space for dissenting voices, how he asked questions rather than issuing proclamations. When Elder Blackwood challenged a decision, Jason didn't shut him down with alpha authority. He engaged with the argument, considered the merits, and explained his reasoning. "The Eastern Patrol reports increased rogue activity," Jason was saying during one such meeting. "Sarah, what's your assessment of our defensive capabilities in that sector?" Not my assessment that she should agree with, not input that he might consider. Her assessment, sought and valued as an equal partner in leadership. "We're vulnerable there," Sarah replied, studying the territorial map spread across the table. "But not because of numbers. The terrain favors ambush tactics, and our current patrol routes are too predictable. I recommend splitting the patrols into smaller, more random groups," Jason finished, his eyes lighting up as he followed her tactical thinking. "Making it harder for scouts to track our movements." "Exactly." Sarah felt a flutter of something she hadn't experienced in months. The intellectual partnership they'd once shared, now rebuilt on a foundation of mutual respect rather than assumed hierarchy. Elder Blackwood cleared his throat pointedly. "With respect, Alpha, these innovations make me nervous. The traditional methods have served us well for generations." "The traditional methods left us open to Marcus Thornfield's attack," Jason replied calmly. "I'd rather adapt than repeat that mistake. And if other packs see these changes as weakness, if they think we've gone soft?" Sarah leaned forward, her voice carrying quiet authority. "Let them come and test that theory. They'll learn the difference between old strength and true strength." The room fell silent, but it wasn't the uncomfortable silence of challenge. It was the thoughtful quiet of wolves who recognized wisdom when they heard it. The conversation Sarah had been both anticipating and dreading came on a night when the full moon hung heavy and bright above the territory. She found Jason waiting for her in the clearing where he had once shattered her world, a choice of location that spoke to his understanding of symbolism and consequence. "I wanted to talk to you here," he said quietly as she approached. "Where it all went wrong, where I failed you so completely." Sarah studied his face in the moonlight, seeing vulnerability where once there had been only pride. "Why here? Why torture yourself with the memory?" "Because I never want to forget what my pride cost us," Jason replied. "I never want to become comfortable enough to make that mistake again." They stood in the silver-washed clearing, two wolves circling the gravity of their shared past. The silence stretched between them, heavy with memory and possibility. "I've apologized," Jason said finally. "I've tried to show you that I've changed, but I realize now that's not enough. I'm not asking you to forget what happened here, Sarah. I'm not asking you to pretend that the girl who was broken doesn't matter. I'm asking you to let me earn a future with the woman you've become." Sarah felt something shift in her chest. Not the wild surge of young love, but something steadier, more mature. The kind of feeling that could weather storms because it had been tested by fire. "You want honesty?" she asked. "Always." "I do forgive you, Jason. Not because you've suffered enough or because time has dulled the pain, but because carrying that anger was poisoning me. Forgiveness isn't for you, it's for me." Relief flooded his features, but Sarah held up a hand. "But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean we go back to what we were. You don't get the girl you threw away, Jason. She's gone. But you might get the woman I've become, if you're worthy of her." "How do I prove that?" he asked. "You don't prove it once and claim victory," Sarah replied. "You prove it every day, in every choice, for as long as we both shall live. You prove it by never again choosing political convenience over personal integrity. You prove it by standing up for what's right even when it costs you something." Jason nodded solemnly. "I understand." "Do you?" Sarah challenged. "Because this isn't a romance novel where grand gestures fix everything. This is real life, where trust takes time to rebuild and love has to be chosen over and over again." "Then I choose you," Jason said simply. "Not because of fate or destiny or the moon goddess's plan. Because I know your worth now. Because I've seen what the world looks like without you in it, and I never want to see that darkness again." When their hands touched, tentatively, carefully, the mate bond flickered back to life. Not the overwhelming surge of young passion, but something quieter and infinitely more precious. A warmth that spoke of second chances and hard-won wisdom. Sarah didn't pull away this time. Instead, she let herself feel the connection, testing its strength like someone examining a bridge that had once collapsed. "It's different," she whispered. "We're different," Jason agreed. "Older, wiser, I hope, less willing to take each other for granted." The bond hummed between them, not commanding their choices but offering possibility. A reminder that some connections, once forged in genuine love, can survive even the worst betrayals if both parties are willing to do the work of rebuilding. "This doesn't mean everything is fixed," Sarah said, though she didn't pull her hand away. "This doesn't mean we pick up where we left off." "I know," Jason replied. "This means we start over, slowly, carefully, with full knowledge of what we're capable of. Both the worst and the best." Sarah nodded, feeling the rightness of it settle into her bones. Not a fairy tale reunion, but something more valuable. A mature love built on truth rather than illusion. The unity ceremony came at the summer solstice, when the days were longest and the pack's hope burned brightest. It wasn't a traditional hierarchy ritual or a mating ceremony, but something entirely new. A celebration of survival, growth, and the bonds that held them together. Sarah stood beside Jason on the ceremonial platform, but not behind him as lunar tradition dictated. They faced the pack as equals, their positions reflecting the new structure they'd built together. "We gather tonight not to celebrate rank or bloodline," Jason's voice carried across the assembled wolves, but to honor the strength we've found in each other, the courage we've shown in battle, the growth we've achieved in peace. We are no longer the pack we were before Marcus Thornfield's attack, Sarah added, her own voice ringing with authority. We are stronger, more united, more honest about where true power lies. The pack howled in response, not the submissive chorus of wolves acknowledging their alpha, but the triumphant song of survivors who had faced annihilation and emerged victorious. The sound echoed across the territory, carrying into the night like a promise to any who would threaten them. Young wolves howled alongside their elders. Warriors sang harmony with healers. The rigid caste system that had once defined their society dissolved in the music of genuine unity. We are pack, Sarah called out, her voice weaving through the howls. Not because we share blood, but because we choose each other. Not because we must, but because we will. The ceremony continued late into the night, but Sarah found herself stepping away at one point, drawn to the small cemetery where her mother rested. Jason didn't follow. He understood this was a moment she needed alone. "I made it, Mama," she whispered to the carved stone marker. "I'm not the girl who waited for permission to belong anymore. I'm the storm that protects, the calm that heals, and the fire they never saw coming." The wind rustled through the trees as if in response, carrying the scent of wildflowers and new growth. Sarah felt her mother's presence in that moment, not as a ghost or spirit, but as a legacy of strength that had always lived within her. "I know who I am now," she continued, "not who they said I should be, not who they said I couldn't be, just me. And that's enough." The rebuilding efforts had resumed in earnest, and Sarah found herself working with the youngest members of the pack, teaching them not just combat techniques, but the deeper lessons she'd learned about inner strength and self-worth. "Were you always strong?" asked a small pup named Emma, her eyes wide with curiosity. Sarah smiled, remembering when Lyra had asked a similar question. "No, little one. I had to remember who I was before they told me who to be." "But how do you remember?" another pup piped up. "What if you forget?" "Then you listen to your heart instead of their voices," Sarah replied. "Your heart always knows the truth about who you are." She watched the young wolves practice their forms, their movements still clumsy but filled with determination. In them, she saw the future of the pack, a generation that would grow up knowing that strength came in many forms, that leadership was earned rather than inherited, that every wolf had value regardless of their rank or bloodline. This is what we fought for, she realized, not just to survive, but to build something better. The relationship between Sarah and Jason developed slowly over the following weeks, not the passionate whirlwind of young love, but something steadier and more sustainable. They took walks together, shared meals, exchanged glances across strategy meetings, a slow burn that felt safer, stronger, because it was built on truth rather than illusion. "Do you ever regret it?" Jason asked one evening as they sat by the lake that bordered their territory. "Everything you went through, the pain, the isolation, the transformation." Sarah considered the question seriously. "I regret the necessity of it. I regret that it took so much pain to teach us both what we needed to learn. But do I regret who I became? Never. Even if it meant losing what we had before? What we had before was built on a foundation of assumptions and unequal power," Sarah replied. "It was beautiful, but it wasn't sustainable. What we're building now, this has a chance to last." Jason nodded, understanding the difference. Young love was fire, bright, consuming, dangerous. Mature love was the sun, steady, nourishing, capable of sustaining life for decades. "I love you," he said quietly. "Not the way I loved you before, but deeper, more honestly, with full knowledge of what that love costs and what it's worth." "I love you too," Sarah replied, "but I love myself more now, and that makes me capable of loving you better." It was perhaps the most romantic thing either of them had ever said. A declaration that their love was strong enough to encompass independence, mature enough to celebrate growth, honest enough to acknowledge that the best partnerships were between two whole people rather than two halves seeking completion. That night, Sarah dreamed of the future. Not visions granted by her powers, but the natural dreams of someone who had finally found peace with her past and hope for what lay ahead. She saw a pack that thrived under shared leadership, where young wolves grew up knowing their worth wasn't determined by others' opinions. She saw herself older, wiser, training new generations of healers and warriors. She saw Jason beside her, not as her superior or protector, but as her partner in building something unprecedented. In the deepest part of the dream, she saw a daughter with silver eyes and her father's stubborn streak, growing up in a world where strength was celebrated in all its forms. A child who would never doubt her worth, never wait for permission to shine, never believe that love required diminishing herself. Sarah woke from the dream with tears on her cheeks, not of sadness but of overwhelming gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this place. The past no longer chained her. The future stretched before her like an open road. The news came with the dawn. A scout from the Eastern Territories, his wolf form streaked with mud and exhaustion. Sarah was among the first to respond to his arrival, her instincts still finely tuned to signs of danger. "Report!" Jason commanded, as the scout shifted back to human form. "Unrest in the Silverpaw territory," the messenger gasped. "Their alpha has been overthrown. Rogues are gathering under a new leader, someone calling himself the Shadowfang. Word is spreading that he's building an army unlike anything we've seen." Sarah and Jason exchanged glances, both reading the implications clearly. Marcus Thornfield had been just the beginning. The real threat was still gathering strength. "How long do we have?" Sarah asked. "Unknown, but the Shadowfang is said to be recruiting aggressively. Anyone with grievances against the established packs, anyone hungry for power or revenge." "Then we prepare," Jason said simply. "We strengthen our alliances, improve our defenses, and make sure every wolf in our territory knows how to fight." Sarah nodded, feeling the familiar surge of purpose that came with new challenges. But this time, she wasn't afraid. She had tested herself in fire and emerged stronger. Whatever came next, she would face it with the full knowledge of her own worth and capabilities. "Alert the council," she instructed the scout. "Tell them we need a strategy meeting within the hour." As the messenger hurried away, Sarah felt Jason's hand brush against hers, a gesture of partnership rather than protection. "Ready for another fight?" he asked quietly. "I'm ready for anything," Sarah replied, and meant it completely. In a private moment later that day, as they stood overlooking their territory from the highest ridge, Jason spoke the words that seemed to encapsulate everything they'd learned and lost and found again. "The moon goddess may have chosen us once," he said, his voice carried by the wind across the landscape they'd fought to protect. "But this time, I choose you. Not because I'm destined to, not because fate demands it, but because I know your worth, because I've seen what you're capable of when the world tries to break you." Sarah smiled, feeling the truth of it settle into her bones. "And I choose you. Not the alpha, not the leader, not the man everyone expects you to be. I choose the man who knelt in my tent and asked for forgiveness. The man who stood up to his own counsel to defend what was right. They stood together on the ridge, two wolves who had been broken and rebuilt, who had lost everything and found something better in the ashes. The wind caught Sarah's midnight cloak, sending it billowing behind her like wings. She is no longer the rejected mate. The wind seemed to whisper through the trees. She is the alpha's equal, the pack's shield, the future's light. And as the sun set over the Bloodfang territory, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Sarah Mitchell, once broken, now whole, stood ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring. Not as someone seeking validation or permission, but as a woman who had claimed her power and learned to wield it with wisdom. The girl who had fled into the forest was gone forever. In her place stood someone infinitely more dangerous and infinitely more valuable, a leader who had earned her authority through trial by fire, a healer who understood that sometimes breaking was necessary for true growth, and a woman who would never again allow anyone to define her worth. Behind them, the pack settlement glowed with warm light and the sounds of life continuing. Ahead of them, new challenges waited in the darkness. But Sarah was no longer afraid of the dark. She had become the light that others followed, the strength that others drew upon, the hope that others believed in. And that, she realized, was the most powerful transformation of all.